What's up, everybody? This is Jason, and you're listening to the Unsung Podcast. So it's been a little while now since I finished the American Guerrillas series, which you should go listen to, by the way. I hear tell it's the best deep dive into the Kansas-Missouri border war that you'll find on the internet. And I'm hard at work now on a new series, which, if you follow me on Substack, you'll know is going to be about the early history of the Mormons in America. But this is not that. I remember well from when I started researching American Guerrillas that it took me probably close to 2 years of reading stuff on the topic before I even felt comfortable starting to write the first episode. And this Mormon series is no different. There's a ton of research to do, and it's going to be a while before I'm ready to start recording anything. So I decided to give you something in between now and then and sort of tide you over. And maybe we'll make a tradition of this kind of thing in the future, doing smaller, less research-intensive one-off or maybe two-part episodes between the major series. So that's what this is. It'll be a two-parter. It's a story that's smaller in scope, but epic nonetheless, and I think you'll really enjoy it. So without further ado, this is The Warriors, Part 1.
Well, you're gonna pull those pistols or whistle Dixie? I get to liking someone, they ain't around long.
I notice when you get to disliking someone, they ain't around for long either.
Pretty sure we have time to bury them fellas.
Hell with them fellas. Buzzards gotta eat, same as worms.
Just as Diomedes hefted a boulder in his hands, a tremendous feat, no two men could hoist it, weak as men are now, but all on his own he raised it high with ease, flung it and struck Aeneas' thigh where the hip bone turns inside the pelvis, the joint they call the cup. It smashed the socket, snapped both tendons too, and the jagged rock tore back the skin in shreds. End quote. That, of course, is a passage from Homer's Iliad. I'm reading from the Robert Fagles translation in case anybody cares. This little stone lifting thing is a kind of formula that shows up several times in the Iliad. A warrior will pick up a stone so big that the poet says multiple men of today wouldn't be able to even lift it, and launches it at an enemy, usually killing or crippling him. I think Hector does it once and somebody else I can't remember off the top of my head, but the point is, men of the past were stronger than men of today. And not only stronger, but wiser and more virtuous too, as Nestor explains in Book 1 of the Iliad. Now, in case you don't know, Book 1 sets up this conflict between Achilles, the greatest warrior the Greeks have at Troy, and Agamemnon, the most powerful king among the Greeks, and the generalissimo of the army, so to speak. They're beefing over something that's not really important to our purposes here, but the point is that Nestor is an old man, an elder among the Greeks, you might say, widely regarded as the wisest among them, and a top advisor to Agamemnon. And this is how his speech goes. Quote, "The son of Atreus smoldered, glaring across at him, but Nestor rose between them, the man of winning words, the clear speaker of Pylos. Sweeter than honey from his tongue the voice flowed on and on. 2 generations of mortal men he had seen go down by now, those who were born and bred with him in the old days, in Pylos' holy realm, and now he ruled the 3rd. He pleaded with both kings, with clear goodwill." Quoting Nestor now, "No more, or enormous sorrow comes to all Achaia. How they would exult, Priam and Priam's sons and all the Trojans. Oh, they'd leap for joy to hear the 2 of you battling on this way, you who excel us all, first in Achaean councils, first in the ways of war. Stop. Please, listen to Nestor. You are both younger than I, and in my time I struck up with better men than you, even you, but never once did they make light of me. I've never seen such men. I never will again. Men like Pirithous, Dryas, that fine captain, Caeneus and Exadius, and Polyphemus, royal prince, and Theseus, Aegeus' boy, a match for the immortals. They were the strongest mortals ever bred on earth, the strongest, and they fought against the strongest too. Shaggy centaurs, wild brutes of the mountains. They hacked them down, terrible, deadly work. And I was in their ranks, fresh out of Pylos, far away from home. They enlisted me themselves, and I fought on my own, a free lance, single-handed. And none of the men who walk the earth these days could battle with those fighters, none. But they took to heart my counsels, marked my words. So now you listen too. End quote. So Nestor is from the same generation as the grandparents of the young warriors like Achilles, and you get this sort of back-in-my-day style speech from him that probably everybody from every generation throughout history can relate to. Let me know if you're a millennial like me and you've ever heard some boomer talk about walking 5 miles to school uphill both ways through blizzards and rain and heat and whatever else. The point being that kids these days are soft or whatever. Or maybe you are a boomer and you've made some of those speeches yourself before, and I would imagine that in that case, you probably heard your own parents or grandparents say something similar when you were a kid. It's just one of those universal human experiences that every generation seems to think their own people were harder and better, and these damn kids today just don't know how easy they got it. To be fair, I think the Nestor flavor of this and the American boomer flavor are very different. Nestor's point is not that the younger generation has it so easy now. What he's doing is establishing his credibility, so Achilles and Agamemnon will take him seriously when he gives them the advice he's about to give, which is to bury the hatchet between them and concern themselves with winning the war. But before I get too far off on a tangent here, the point of saying all this is that there's this trope, going all the way back to Homer, the earliest surviving literature in the Western world that we have, that says older generations, generally speaking, are better, wiser, stronger, more virtuous, etc., than younger generations. Now again, if you're an American millennial like me, it's easy to scoff at that notion when your personal experience of the generation before you is of the boomers. But another sort of take on this idea is that there's actually something to it. The idea being that while the general trend of humanity from our perspective today might be advancement and progress in, let's say, the technological domain, the trend in the moral or quality of character domain has actually been the opposite. And for modern people, it's easy to confuse technological progress with moral progress. Of course, whenever you talk about progress of any kind, it always begs the question, progress towards what? And likewise, when you talk about regress or degeneration, you can ask the question, regress away from what? It makes perfect sense in the Christian context of the fall, where Adam and Eve originally lived in perfect communion with God. They sinned and broke that communion, introduced death into the world, and the human race as a whole has been slipping further away from union with God ever since. So that would be what we're regressing away from. But whatever the truth of this idea, I think, in the Iliad's formulation at least, it's to be taken more as a general trend than some kind of hard and fast rule. Men of the past in general were better, stronger, more virtuous, more courageous, more loyal than men of today in general, but that doesn't mean that every man of the current generation is worse than every man of the last generation. After all, one of the men Nestor is speaking to there is none other than Achilles himself, the very man whose rage is the subject of the entire Iliad. Gotta sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, right? Achilles later in the story will go on to fight a river and win by choking off its flow with the stacked bodies of his Trojan enemies. It also doesn't necessarily mean that every generation throughout human history will be worse than the one before it and better than the one after it because, well, general trends allow for some ups and downs along the way. The point is, even though the general trend in quality may be downwards, every once in a while, some man or group of men might poke their heads up above that trend line and do something that matches or even surpasses the deeds of the men who came before them. This story is about one such group of men who found themselves in an impossible scenario, and it's the kind of story that, well, the fact that we've never gotten a big-budget Hollywood epic retelling of it, a la Troy or Gladiator, is honestly a war crime. Our story starts in the year 401 BC, but to set the stage, I have to start with some of the things that were going on in the earlier 5th century BC in the Greek world. Now, if you think of ancient Greek warfare, the first thing that comes to mind is probably either the Trojan War or the last stand of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, or maybe Alexander the Great. It's kind of funny that today we lump all those into the category of ancient Greek when they were really as far apart from each other in time as we are from William Wallace and Robert the Bruce, but that's kind of a side note. The Battle of Thermopylae, of course, took place in the year 480 BC, 79 years before the beginning of our story, which happens to be pretty close to the same amount of time separating us today from World War II, for an easy point of reference. 10 years before that, in 490 BC, was the first Persian invasion of Greece, led by the Great King Darius, which was turned back at the Battle of Marathon. Then the 480 invasion was led by Darius' son Xerxes. His army eventually pushed through the Spartans and their allies at the Hot Gates, and actually took and occupied Athens for a little bit. But then later that same year, his fleet was destroyed at the great naval battle of Salamis, which kind of put a damper on the whole thing. Xerxes decided to call it quits after that and head back home. He did leave a sizable land force behind, but they were defeated at Plataea the following year in 479. These conflicts are known collectively as the Greco-Persian Wars, and that was the last time the Persians ever threatened Greece. Except it wasn't, really. It was the last time a Persian army ever threatened Greece, but the Persians didn't just leave the Greeks alone after that. They got smarter about how they went about competing with them. Through those two invasions, Athens had kind of emerged as the leader of the Greek coalition that banded together to defeat the Persians. Remember, Greece wasn't one united nation at this time. It was a collection of separate city-states with a common language, culture, and heritage, and it was far from united. But part of the story of those two Persian invasions is that enough of the Greek world, not all, but enough, realized that, hey, this giant empire is an existential threat to all of us, and none of us are strong enough to resist them on our own, so we better band together to drive them off. Athens had been one of the main ringleaders of that whole effort. Once the Persians were driven off, it didn't take all that long before the Greek city-states were fighting amongst themselves again. But Athens in particular had bigger ambitions. They got together with some allies in 478 BC and formed the Delian League, an alliance of city-states whose purpose was to protect against any further invasions, but also to go on offense against the Persians. They did so, attacking and conquering Persian cities on the coast of Asia Minor, and over the next few decades they became the greatest naval power the Aegean had ever seen up to that time. Meanwhile, Sparta maintained its position as the primary land power in the Greek world and leader of the Delian League's main rival for hegemony, the Peloponnesian League. It seems almost inevitable in hindsight that these two leagues, the Delian and the Peloponnesian, the Athenian and the Spartan, the up-and-coming sea power and the older, more established land power, would eventually come to blows, and they did, in what is now known as the Peloponnesian War. This was a catastrophic war that lasted almost 30 years and reshaped the political landscape in the Greek world. And who else was watching it all go down, from a safe distance, of course, than the Persians? It was due, at least in part, to Persian intervention and financial aid that the Spartans and the Peloponnesian League eventually came out on top, and the Delian League was broken up at the end of the war in 404 BC. But during all this time, the Persian Empire was having internal problems of its own. Xerxes was assassinated in 465 BC, but despite that, his son Artaxerxes was able to take the throne after his death. Artaxerxes reigned until 424 BC when he died and his son Darius II took over. It was during this Darius' reign that the Persians got involved in the Peloponnesian War, and Darius II died in 404, the same year the war ended. He was succeeded by his son, Artaxerxes II. So just to keep track of where we are in the generational timeline. Artaxerxes II is the great-grandson of Xerxes I and the great-great-grandson of Darius I. And Artaxerxes II is the first character who is really important to this story, because while he had succeeded his father to the throne of Persia, he had a brother who also wanted that throne. That brother is known to history as Cyrus the Younger, and in 401 BC, he went to war to try to take the throne from Artaxerxes. These kinds of family power struggles were absolutely common in the Persian Empire, by the way. I've skipped over the ones that don't matter to this story, but they were happening at some level in basically every generation from Darius I to Artaxerxes II, so it shouldn't come as a big surprise to anyone when it happens again. Now, there's one big important thing the Persians had learned over the last century or so of direct and indirect involvement in Greek political and military affairs, and that is that the Greeks could freaking fight. In fact, there was probably no better heavy infantry unit in the world at that time than the Greek hoplite phalanx. In those Persian invasions, the Greeks, by all accounts, had been vastly outnumbered in every major battle, most notably at Thermopylae, and even there they held the pass for 3 days and were only defeated when the Persians found a way through the mountains to circle around and get behind them. Then the Greeks won at Plataea, where they were still outnumbered by a lot, although not nearly as bad as they were at Thermopylae. There could be a lot of reasons for this Greek ability to punch above their weight numerically. If you were an ancient Greek, you might say it was because the Greek soldier was stronger and more manly than the effeminate Persian slaves. But of course, you also had things like equipment, training, and unit cohesion that the Greek hoplites just might have been better at for a variety of cultural reasons. Hoplites were surprisingly versatile for what they were, but really excelled in the role of holding ground against an enemy. And when you threw them into a combined arms force along with cavalry and some lighter armed troops like peltasts, archers, and slingers, they were quite a force to be reckoned with. The Persians figured out pretty early on that whatever you planned to do, it didn't hurt to have some Greek hoplites in your army. How did Persians get Greek hoplites in their armies? Well, one way they commonly got foreign soldiers in general into their armies was by conquest. Subjugate a place, and then the next time you have to go to war, they'll have to send troops to help you out. Herodotus in his histories gives a big rundown of all these exotic troop types from all the far-flung parts of the Persian Empire that made up Xerxes' army. But the Persians never conquered Greece, or at least not very much of it, and not for very long. And what's more, it turned out that of all those exotic troop types, the area that the Persians were most lacking in was heavy infantry, which happened to be exactly the role that the Greek hoplite filled. Well, when Darius invaded in 490 BC, he had some contingents with him from the Ionian Greeks, that is, Greeks living on the coast of Asia Minor, where Turkey is today, and then when Xerxes invaded 10 years later, some of the city-states on the Greek mainland submitted to him rather than join Athens and Sparta in resisting. The most notable of those were probably Thessaly and Thebes, so he got some hoplites from those cities to fight with him at Plataea. So they'd had a taste of what that was like in those invasions, but Persian armies didn't really start to acquire large numbers of them until later in the 5th century, when it became more common for Greek soldiers to fight as mercenaries for the highest bidder. Now, this story is going to revolve around an army of Greek mercenaries, so it's worth taking a minute to think about where this kind of thing came from and how this soldier of fortune gig became a thing that Greeks did. To understand that, we have to think about the classical mode of Greek warfare. It's one city-state versus another, or sometimes alliances of several city-states squaring off. They engage in this highly ritualized form of warfare where they march out to the frontier. The priests do their sacrifices to see if it's favorable to attack. Once that's all squared away, the two phalanxes march to contact and have a shoving match with shields and spears until one side breaks. Most of the casualties occur after one side breaks, by the way. It turns out it's a lot easier to stab somebody with a spear when they don't have a wall of 3-foot diameter shields in front of them. Then after a clear winner is decided, the side that broke will admit defeat and send envoys to ask the winning side for a truce to bury their dead. The truce would be granted, both sides would bury their dead, The winners would set up a trophy on the battlefield to signify their victory, and then the winners would probably get favorable terms for whatever it was they were fighting over. Like I said before, this form of warfare was highly ritualized, and it was also limited, which is important. Nobody was going to take advantage of the fact that your army just broke and ran to march into your city and raze it to the ground and kill all the women and children. Honor demanded that you be gracious in victory, grant the losers their truce, and allow them to bury their dead. And also, probably if you did something like that, you'd instantly become a pariah and you'd just unite the entire Greek world against you. But another reason this kind of warfare was limited is that Greek city-states didn't have professional armies for the most part. Their soldiers were citizen soldiers, and their primary job was not fighting. It was farming, or plying some trade in the city, maybe. They weren't training full-time to be soldiers. In fact, the exception proves the rule in this case. The Spartans were widely regarded as the most powerful land army in the Greek world for centuries, and part of the reason for that was that, unlike most everybody else, they did have a professional army. They had their helot slave class to do all the farming and mundane trades for them, and so the Spartan citizens could and did train for war full time. But in the second half of the 5th century BC, you start to see a shift away from this kind of ritualized, limited warfare. The clash between Athens and Sparta in the Peloponnesian Wars was unlike anything the Greek world had seen up to that point, probably since the Trojan War. While the Persian invasions were a big deal for sure, they'd actually been pretty short. Darius' invasion of the Greek mainland lasted less than a year, and Xerxes lasted less than 2 years. But the Peloponnesian War brought sustained, long-term, grinding warfare year after year with immediate neighbors, lasting in total almost 30 years. Just like America's forever wars in the Middle East, in some cases you had guys fighting at the end of it who weren't even born yet at the beginning. Well, as a consequence of all that, this ritualized, limited form of warfare started to go by the wayside. Armies and soldiers got more professional as everybody involved tried to gain an edge. And as they got more professional and dedicated more time and effort to training for war, they had less time for doing regular civilian things. Add to that the fact that these were obviously tumultuous times. Greek city-states were commonly pretty broke, and the Persians had a gold supply that might as well have been infinite. And throughout the 5th century, you started to see this trickle of Greek soldiers with no money and nothing better to do, making their way over to Persia to see if they could make a few derricks doing what they did best, which was soldiering. Sometimes major Greek politicians and statesmen would do this, either after being exiled from their home cities or as a way of escaping volatile situations at home. One of the first to do that was Themistocles, the famous Athenian naval strategist who engineered the Greek victory at Salamis but was then ostracized just a few years later. Then during the Peloponnesian War, Alcibiades pulled something similar, and he might have been the ultimate you-can-just-do-things giga-chad of the ancient Greek world. Then at times you'd see slightly larger groups of rank-and-file soldiers going over to Persia to fight for some satrap or other in either aiding some rebellion or suppressing one. By the time the Peloponnesian War ended in 404 BC, this was a pretty well-established phenomenon. So what happens when a war such as that one finally ends, and now you have a bunch of fairly professional soldiers, battle-hardened veterans, who have pretty much grown up fighting and never really known anything else? Well, weirdly enough, that doesn't sound all that dissimilar from the Missouri bushwhackers we talked about in the previous series, right? We know not insignificant numbers of those guys turned to crime after the war, in part because that's the skill set they'd built up as guerrillas. And one wonders what they'd have done if maybe there had been a major empire nearby that was in need of good soldiers. Actually, to make even a further comparison, remember that some former Confederates did exactly that when they offered their services to Maximilian I down in Mexico. If you were a soldier by trade, there was nobody left to fight at home, and an empire with infinite gold in need of soldiers was just a short boat ride away, well, it might not seem like the worst idea to hop on that boat. Our story really begins in earnest in the city of Sardis in western Anatolia. For reference, this is the modern Turkish city of Sart. In the late 5th century BC, it was the capital of the Persian satrapy of Lydia, and it was a place where, starting around 403, one Cyrus the Younger was recruiting an army for a campaign against his Persian political rival in the area, Tissaphernes. Conveniently enough, that just so happened to be the year after the Peloponnesian War ended, and the end of the war brought with it a surplus of unemployed Greek soldiers. Well, several cities along the coast that belonged to Tissaphernes started revolting to Cyrus, and as he went about his recruiting, he helped and supported them with the troops he'd gathered so far. One of these, Miletus, developed into a siege when Tissaphernes got wind of the revolt before it happened and took steps to put a stop to it. I'm not narrating all this in detail because it's not all that important to this story, but it's just important to realize that there was a lot going on in Ionia for these next couple years. And most importantly, Cyrus made sure that his brother Artaxerxes, the Great King, knew there was a lot going on in this campaign against Tissaphernes. By the spring of 401 BC, Cyrus had this Tissaphernes situation well enough in hand that he felt like he could move ahead with the next step in his plans, which was to gather up all these soldiers he'd been recruiting into one place, Sardis, and march them east for a sort of police action against the unruly Pisidians, which was a people that lived sort of along the southern coast of Asia Minor. The army Cyrus marched with was of mixed nationalities, but its core was a mercenary force made up of thousands of those unemployed Greeks left over from the Peloponnesian War. Now, our main source for this whole story is an Athenian named Xenophon, who actually marched with this army himself and played a major role in the events to come, and once it was all over, he wrote a book about it, the Anabasis. I'll introduce him more in a minute, but for now he gives us some numbers for the troops that marched into Pisidia with Cyrus. According to Xenophon, there were about 6,300 hoplites and 800 lighter infantry, peltasts and some others, that marched out of Sardis. During the march, they were met by a further 3,300 Greek hoplites, 1,300 peltasts, and 200 Cretan archers. Now, the numbers are kind of sketchy. They always are with ancient warfare, and even Xenophon himself isn't completely consistent within his own story. For example, the numbers I just gave you come from adding up the numbers from all the different contingents that Xenophon lists, and they give you a grand total of about 9,600 hoplites, 2,100 light infantry, and 200 archers. But when Xenophon actually lists the grand total, he says it's about 11,000 hoplites and 2,000 peltasts. There's other references to these numbers in the book, and plenty of academics have tried to make sense of it all and square the different statements with each other. It doesn't hugely matter what the exact number was, but the important thing is that there seem to have been between about 12,000 and 14,000 total Greeks in Cyrus' army when he marched east. But although Xenophon never calls them this in his book, the Greek mercenary corps of Cyrus' army would become famous in history by a different name, the Myrioi, or the 10,000. 10,000 is just a nice round number. It has a better ring to it than the 12,900 or whatever the exact number happened to be, right? Just like the army overall was mixed between Greeks and barbarians, the 10,000 were a pan-Hellenic force, meaning they came from many different city-states all over the Greek world. The largest single contingent of about 4,000 hoplites was led by Xenius of Arcadia. He had about 2,000 men each under Clearchus of Lacedaemon and Proxenos of Boeotia, 1,500 under Menon of Thessaly, and various smaller contingents from places like Achaia, Megara, Stymphalos, and there was even one general from Syracuse on the island of Sicily. Now, what's interesting about this army is that although it was somewhat pan-Hellenic, the bulk of it came from cities that were either in the Peloponnese itself or had been otherwise allied to the Spartan-led Peloponnesian League during that catastrophic war that had just ended a few years ago. There were a few contingents from places that were, let's say, less staunchly Spartan-aligned than most of the Peloponnesians, such as the Thebans, who had always had a pretty rocky relationship with Athens, but maybe weren't all that enthusiastic about the Spartans either by this time. Then there were the Thessalians, who were kind of positioned way off in northern Greece and had been either kind of disinterested in the war or maybe leaned a little bit towards Athens. And then to top it all off, the author of the book, Xenophon himself, was an Athenian, from the city that had been the mortal enemy of the Peloponnesians for the last 30 years almost. It's maybe a little bit like if an American mercenary army had gone to fight in Mexico or something in 1868, and it was made up of units from Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, South Carolina, and then a couple units from like northern Kentucky or Nebraska, and then there's one guy from Boston who kind of tags along for the ride. I say tag along for a reason, and we'll get to that in a second, but for now the point is that there's potential for a fair bit of internal conflict in an army with this kind of makeup. Beyond the obvious factional ties between the Spartan allied and Athenian allied or neutral contingents, you also had potential for conflict among the Peloponnesians. The Peloponnesian League was always supposed to be more of an alliance or confederation of independent states led by the Spartans, rather than an explicitly Spartan empire. This was in contrast to the Delian League, which, at least later in its history, became much more of what you'd call an Athenian empire. And as any Confederate statesman during the American Civil War could tell you, that confederation structure can come with its own internal challenges. In this case, the main conflict to worry about will be that the Arcadians start to wonder why they still have to fight under Spartan generals when they make up the largest contingent in the army, which mirrors some of the problems the Spartans had had at various points during the war trying to keep their allies in line. And that's something to keep in mind as we go forward. Now, for Xenophon himself, I told you a minute ago that he just kind of tagged along on this expedition, and that's because he was never supposed to be a general or really an officer of any kind in this army. And why would he be? After all, he was an Athenian, and this army made up mostly of Peloponnesians. Well, Xenophon tells us how he got involved, and this actually comes from Book 3 of the Anabasis because he tells it a little bit out of order, but this will also shed some light on what was really going on with this whole campaign Cyrus was now undertaking against the Pisidians. Xenophon writes, quote, "In the army there was a certain Xenophon, an Athenian. He did not accompany the army as a general, nor as a captain, nor as an ordinary soldier. Proxenos, who was a long-standing guest friend of his, had sent for him to come from home, promising him that if he were to come he would make him a friend of Cyrus. Proxenos indeed said that he regarded Cyrus as more important to him than was his own native land. However, when Xenophon read Proxenos' letter, he first discussed with Socrates the Athenian what he would advise about the journey. Socrates was apprehensive that becoming a friend of Cyrus would be something blameworthy in the eyes of the city of Athens, because Cyrus was reputed to have assisted the Lacedaemonians wholeheartedly in their war against Athens, and he counseled Xenophon to go to Delphi and take the gods' advice about the journey. Xenophon went there and asked Apollo to which of the gods he should perform sacrifices and offer prayers in order to make the journey that he had in mind in accordance with the best and most honorable course of action, and then, his mission honorably accomplished, to reach safety again. Apollo, in response, told him the names of the gods to whom he should perform sacrifice. After he had come back again, he recounted the oracle to Socrates, and when Socrates heard it, he strongly criticized Xenophon because he had not first asked whether it would be more fitting for him to make his way abroad or to remain at home, instead making his own judgment that he ought to go, and inquiring only how he might make his way with the greatest honor. But since that was the question he had asked, he had to act, Socrates said, as the god had ordered him to. Xenophon, for his part, accordingly offered sacrifices to the gods whom Apollo had ordained, and set sail. He caught up with Proxenos and Cyrus in Sardis when they were about to depart along the road to the interior, and was introduced to Cyrus. Proxenos was eager for him to stay with them, and Cyrus joined fully in his efforts. Cyrus said that as soon as the campaign was over, he would immediately let him go home. The expedition was said to be against Pisidia. Thus Xenophon, in truth, served in the army as the consequence of deceit, but not on the part of Proxenos, for he did not know the attack was being made against the king, nor did any other of the Greeks except Clearchus, though by the time that they reached Cilicia, it seemed clear to everyone that the expedition was against the king. Unwilling though they were, and fearful of the journey, the majority still followed along from a sense of shame toward Cyrus and toward each other, and among these was Xenophon." End quote. So first of all, yes, that is the Socrates he's talking about there, the philosopher. Xenophon also wrote some Socratic dialogues himself, by the way. And second of all, it turned out that all this campaigning against Tissaphernes and against the Pisidians was really a cover for Cyrus, and his real objective the whole time was to march all the way into the Persian heartland and usurp his brother Artaxerxes as the great king. Though he did have some real beef with Tissaphernes, that was kind of a secondary reason he undertook this campaign against him. The beef goes back to when Darius II, father of Cyrus and Artaxerxes, died and appointed Artaxerxes to be his successor. Xenophon writes, quote, "After Darius died and Artaxerxes succeeded to the kingship, Tissaphernes maligned Cyrus to his brother on the ground that he was plotting against the king. Artaxerxes was persuaded of this and arrested Cyrus, intending to put him to death, but their mother Parysatis successfully pleaded on his behalf, and so he sent him back again to his province. Departing as he did, dishonored and having been put in great danger, Cyrus set about planning how to avoid ever again being at his brother's mercy, and how instead to become king in his place if he could." End quote. So, it's a little bit sketchy from Xenophon's telling. Xenophon doesn't really say whether Cyrus really was plotting against Artaxerxes the first time, before he was imprisoned. So you could kind of read this in two different ways. Maybe Cyrus really was plotting and got caught, or maybe he was innocent and Artaxerxes believed Tissaphernes' false accusations, and Cyrus thought, well, I've already been falsely accused, but that's actually a good idea. Maybe I'll try this revolt thing for real. Either way, that seems to be what the beef with Tissaphernes really went back to. Tissaphernes either ratted Cyrus out or falsely accused him, and so Cyrus must not have felt too bad about making war on him. But the larger reason for Cyrus to be fighting Tissaphernes was to give himself a plausible excuse in the eyes of Artaxerxes to be gathering such an army as he was. And the campaign against the Pisidians was to give a plausible reason for marching inland with that army. He had to have known that Artaxerxes would eventually find out what he was doing, but this was all meant to delay that inevitability and buy himself time before Artaxerxes was able to mobilize an army of his own to meet him. And Cyrus kept his true objective a secret from his own army, too. Like Xenophon says there, the only Greek he told about it was the Spartan general Clearchus. There might be a couple reasons for that. First of all is OPSEC. The more people there are who know what he's doing, the sooner the news is likely to make it back to Artaxerxes. Another reason is that it might be quite a bit harder to recruit an army of mercenaries if your pool of recruits knew you were trying to go up against the Great King of the Persian Empire himself. For those men, if you're trying to be a soldier of fortune, you'd want to make sure you have a decent chance of actually living long enough to collect the fortune. It's kind of pointless to get paid if you're just going to march off to a near-certain death with little to no chance of success, and the risk-to-reward ratio of an expedition like this one would just not have been there. Mercenaries generally don't sign up for what amounts to suicide with extra steps, so Cyrus had to give them a story about local tribal police actions with a high likelihood of success to get them on board and keep them on board. But then, of course, if the army's been told they're going to go police the Pisidians, and then they march all the way through Pisidia and keep going east, they're going to figure out pretty quick that something else is going on, and they did. By the late summer of 401 BC, they were in Cilicia, which is kind of on the north side of the right angle formed by the southern coast of Turkey and the west coast of the modern-day Levant. Xenophon tells us that once the army figured out they'd been lied to about the expedition's objective, they were not happy. He writes, quote, "Cyrus and the army remained in Cilicia for 20 days, for the soldiers said they were not going any farther. They already suspected that they were being led against the king, and they said they had not been hired for that. Clearchus was the first to try to force his own soldiers to go on, but they started to throw things at him and at the draft animals carrying his baggage whenever they began to move forward. On this occasion, Clearchus only just escaped being stoned to death, but later on, when he realized that he was not going to be able to succeed by force, he called together an assembly of his soldiers. To begin with, he stood there in tears for a long time. When they saw it, they were amazed and fell silent, and then he spoke as follows." Quoting Clearchus now, and remember, he's the only one of the Greeks who was told in advance what the objective was. "Brave soldiers, do not be amazed that I take badly what is going on now. Cyrus became my guest friend, and among other ways in which he honored me, though I was an exile from my native land, he gave me 10,000 darics. Once I had taken the money, I did not stockpile it for my private use, nor did I squander any of it on luxury, but over time I spent it on pay for you. Initially, I waged war on the Thracians, and, along with you, proceeded to exact revenge on them on behalf of Greece, driving them out of the Chersonese when they wanted to deprive the Greeks who lived there of their land. When Cyrus sent for me, I took you with me and set off on the way in order to repay him for his kind treatment of me by helping him if he needed anything. Since you do not want to accompany him on his way any farther, of necessity I shall have either to betray you and continue to enjoy Cyrus' friendship, or to break my word to him and stay with you. I do not know if I shall in truth be doing what is right, but whether I am or no, I will choose you, and I will suffer along with you whatever it may be necessary to suffer. Nobody shall ever say that, having led Greeks to the lands of the barbarians, I betrayed the Greeks and chose the friendship of the barbarians instead. Rather than that, since you do not wish to obey me or follow me, I will follow along with you and take the necessary consequences. I regard you as being my fatherland, my friends, and my allies, and with your assistance I think I would be held in honor wherever I might be. But if I were left without you, I think I would not be powerful enough either to help a friend or to ward off an enemy. So think of me as someone who will go wherever you may go. Back to Xenophon. That was his speech. The soldiers, both his own troops and the others who heard it, praised him for refusing to make his way to where the king was, and more than 2,000 took their weapons and baggage from the sections of Xenius and Pasion and encamped near Clearchos. Cyrus was at a loss at these events, and, in his distress, sent repeatedly for Clearchos. He refused to go, but at the same time he sent a messenger to Cyrus behind the soldiers' backs to tell him to keep his spirits up, as things would turn out all right. He told him to continue to send for him, but said he would not go. After this he brought together his own soldiers, and those who had come over to him and any of the others who wanted to come to the meeting, and spoke as follows. Quoting Clearchos again. Brave soldiers, it is clear that Cyrus' stance toward us is the same as ours toward him. We are no longer his soldiers, obviously, since we are not following along with him, and he is no longer our paymaster. However, I know that he thinks he is being wronged by us, and for that reason, even when he sends for me, I do not want to go. Most of all, this is because I am ashamed, knowing in my own heart that I lied to him in every respect. But on top of that, it is because I am also afraid that he might seize me and punish me for the wrongs he thinks I have done him. So it seems to me that this is no time for us to sleep or be careless of our own affairs. We need instead to discuss what we have to do under the circumstances. And at any rate, as long as we remain here, it seems to me we must look out for how we are to do so as safely as possible, and if we decide to leave now, for how we shall leave as safely as possible. And also for how we are going to obtain food supplies, since without those it's no use having either generals or rank-and-file soldiers. Cyrus is a man who is a highly worthwhile friend to anyone who is a friend of his, but he is also the most awkward of enemies to anyone to whom he is hostile, and he has infantry, cavalry, and naval forces at his disposal that all of us alike see and know well. Indeed, to my mind, we don't seem to be camped very far away from him. And so now is the time for any of you to suggest what he reckons to be best. Back to Xenophon. Having said this, he broke off. After this, some people stood up spontaneously in order to say what their judgment was, while others did so prompted by him, making clear what a problem it would be without Cyrus' goodwill either to stay or to go. One of them, pretending to be keen on making his way as quickly as possible back to Greece, actually proposed that they should first choose new generals with the utmost speed if Clearchos did not want to lead them back home, and that they should then buy their food supplies in the market, which was in the barbarian army's encampment, and pack up, and after that go and ask Cyrus for transport ships in order to set sail. And if he didn't give them ships, they would ask Cyrus for a guide who would lead them away through friendly territory. If he didn't give them a guide either, they should draw up in line of battle as soon as they could manage to do so, and also send troops ahead to occupy the heights so that they could not be taken beforehand by either Cyrus or the Cilicians, many of whom, and much of their property, he added, are in our possession, since we plundered them. That was the sort of thing this individual said. After him, Clearchos spoke to this effect. Now quoting Clearchos again, "Let none of you say that I will undertake this command, for I see many reasons why it should not be me who does this. But I will obey whichever man you choose to the very best of my ability, to let you see that I know how to be ruled just as much as any other person." Back to Xenophon. After Clearchus, another soldier stood up and pointed out the silliness of telling them to ask for transport ships, as if Cyrus were making a voyage back again. And on the other hand, he pointed out how silly it would be to ask for a guide, and quoting this other soldier now, from the very person whose enterprise we are ruining. And if we actually trust the guide Cyrus gives us, if he does give us one, we might just as well tell Cyrus to occupy the heights in advance for our benefit. I would hesitate to embark on any transport ships that he might give us, in case he sank us with his triremes, and I would be afraid to follow any guide he might give us in case he led us into a place from which it would not be possible to escape. On the contrary, if I was going away against Cyrus' wishes, I would want to conceal my departure from him, but that is not possible. The whole idea is a load of nonsense, I say. I think men should go to Cyrus, whoever are suitable for the purpose, along with Clearchus, and ask him how he wants to make use of us, and if the enterprise he has in mind is close enough to what he used mercenaries for in the past, we too should follow him, and not be greater cowards than those who accompanied him to the interior previously. If, on the other hand, his enterprise seems greater than the previous one and involves more hard work and danger, we should expect that either he persuades us and leads us forward, or he is persuaded by us and lets us depart in friendship. In this way, if we were to follow him, we would follow him eagerly, as his friends, and if we departed, we would depart safely. But whatever he says in response should be reported back here, and when we have heard it, we can make up our minds in the light of it. And back to Xenophon one more time. That was what they decided, and they chose men and sent them along with Clearchus to ask Cyrus the questions the army had settled on. He answered that his current information was that Abracomas, a man who was an enemy of his, was presently by the river Euphrates, 12 days' march away. So, he said, he wanted to go after him, and if he was there, he said, he longed to give him his due punishment. If he fled, we will have a discussion there in light of that. When they heard this, the delegates made their report to the soldiers, and they were suspicious that he was leading them against the king, but they still decided to follow him. However, they asked for more pay, and Cyrus promised to give them all half again as much as they had had before. A derrick and a half per month for each soldier rather than a derrick. At this stage, nobody heard anyone say, at any rate openly, that he was leading them to attack the king. End quote. So you see what kind of bind the army was in right now. If they'd been told up front that they were signing up to go fight the king himself, most likely not many of them would have ever agreed to it in the first place. But by the time they figure out what's actually going on and what they're actually being asked to do, they're already hundreds of miles deep in Persian territory, and aborting the mission at this point without the sanction of their Persian leader is probably not the best idea either, because they're probably going to have a hell of a time getting back to Greek territory. And by the way, they won't be getting paid anymore because Cyrus controls the coin. And then there's some really clever manipulation going on by Clearchus here, who was the one guy who did know the real objective at the beginning. Rather than directly making the argument to the men that they really can't leave Cyrus at this point, he kind of lets them come up with the idea on their own, through this little game he plays. And even though in the end Cyrus comes up with another lie to tell the army about what their mission is, it seems like everybody kind of knows what's up. But they also understand that at this point the only way out is through, because honestly, who wants to march 400 miles through hostile, mountainous territory back to the Greek world? Well, as it turned out, all of Cyrus' OPSEC didn't end up buying him all that much in the way of delaying Artaxerxes finding out about his plans, because Tissaphernes was not a stupid man, and before Cyrus had even left Sardis, he'd kind of sussed out what was really going on. This army Cyrus was gathering of some 13,000 Greeks and then various barbarians, bringing the total up to somewhere between 25 and 30,000 men, seemed like pretty extreme overkill for a police action against the Pisidians, and from there it wasn't that hard to figure out where they were going. As soon as he figured it out, he took off for the Persian interior personally to let Artaxerxes know what was happening, and since it was just him and a small cavalry escort, he was pretty easily able to outpace Cyrus' army of 25,000 or more. So while Cyrus and his army continued their march out of Cilicia, Artaxerxes already knew they were coming. He had plenty of time to raise an army to meet them, and he waited for them near Babylon. Now, to give a little overview of the geography here, if you look at a map, you'll see that the two major rivers that flow through Mesopotamia are the Tigris and the Euphrates. These flow roughly parallel to each other from northwest to southeast, and both eventually empty into the Persian Gulf. Their courses aren't perfectly parallel. They start kind of far apart in the northwest and then flow towards each other to a closest approach point of about 20 to 25 miles apart in the vicinity of Babylon before widening out again, and then later they approach even closer and then widen again before they flow into the Persian Gulf separately. But the point is, there's a narrow neck of land about 20 to 25 miles wide in the vicinity of Babylon that forms kind of a natural choke point for any army marching from the northwest between the two rivers into the Persian interior, and that's where Artaxerxes waited for Cyrus. The approach march for Cyrus' army was not an easy one and could probably be a story of its own. Cyrus eventually came clean with the Greeks about who they were really going to fight, and the soldiers basically said, "Yeah, we know," but they were along for the ride at that point, whether they wanted to be or not. There was a march through the desert where a bunch of animals starved to death and the army ran low on grain. There was a mutiny by a couple contingents of the Greeks who ended up leaving. There was even a plot against Cyrus' life by a Persian named Orontas, who ended up being put to death. In the end, the army arrived at this narrow neck of land between the two rivers. There was a wall there, called the Median Wall, which seems to have been built in the time of the Babylonian king Nebuchadrezzar II, some 200 years before this time, and it ran almost all the way across the neck, but not quite. There was a little gap between the western end of the wall and the Euphrates River. Artaxerxes had apparently improved the defenses of this area with a trench that started at the Euphrates some distance in front of the wall to the northwest and ended about the midpoint of the wall. But oddly, Artaxerxes didn't actually position his army to defend the wall or the trench. Xenophon writes that there was still about a 20-foot gap between the trench and the Euphrates, and Cyrus' entire army was able to march through that gap unopposed and get into the rear of both trench and wall. And there, in open ground, on the north bank of the Euphrates, was where the two armies finally met a couple days later, near a place called Cunaxa. Now, I told you earlier that Cyrus' army was about 25 to 30,000 strong, including the Greek contingent of around 13,000, but I have to admit that I gave you the numbers that the modern academic faggots will give. The ancient gigachad Xenophon, on the other hand, gives different numbers, and this is what he says. Quote, "The number of Greeks came to a total hoplite force of 10,400, together with 2,500 peltasts, while the number of barbarians with Cyrus was 100,000, plus around 20 scythed chariots. People said that the enemy numbered 1,200,000, plus 200 scythed chariots. There were 6,000 cavalry as well, which Artaxerxes commanded. These were stationed in front of the king himself. There were 4 commanders of the king's army, each with 300,000 troops: Abracomas, Tissaphernes, Gobryas, and Arbaces. Of these troops, 900,000, together with 150 scythed chariots, were present for the battle, since Abracomas arrived 5 days late, bringing his army from Phoenicia. This was the tenor of the reports made to Cyrus by those who had deserted from the great king before the battle, and after the battle, those of the enemy who had subsequently been captured reported the same." End quote. So Xenophon has Cyrus' army outnumbered almost 9-1 here. About 900,000 in Artaxerxes' army present on the field, and then around 112,000 or so in Cyrus' army when you count both the Greeks and the barbarians. The modern academic faggots will tell you that Cyrus had around 25,000 and Artaxerxes had around 40,000, which would make Cyrus still outnumbered, but not by nearly as much. Also, 40,000 to 25,000 is not nearly as badass as 900,000 to 112,000, so I'm going with Giga Chad Xenophon on this one. He was there. He probably counted every single man himself, right? What Xenophon and the faggots both agree on, though, is the size of the Greek contingent, which is right around that 13,000 number we've already talked about. So picture Cyrus' army advancing southeast, down the left bank of the Euphrates, with the river on their right flank, and Artaxerxes' army coming up the other way, with the river on their left flank. Cyrus positioned his Greeks on the right, with the peltasts on the extreme right flank next to the river, some Paphlagonian cavalry next to them, and the main hoplite phalanx coming next. He put himself and his cavalry escort directly in the center, and his Persian lieutenant with all the barbarian troops on the left, furthest from the river. Artaxerxes had cavalry on his left flank nearest the river, then a block of mixed light and heavy infantry next to them, with scythed chariots out in front. These are chariots with big old blades projecting out from their axles, so they'll cut men down as they ride through an enemy formation. And this whole left flank was commanded by Tissaphernes. Then Artaxerxes himself commanded the right flank with a special force of cavalry led by Artaxerxes out in front. Now, because Artaxerxes significantly outnumbered Cyrus, his main line could be longer than that of Cyrus while maintaining the same depth. This didn't matter as much on the southwestern flank because both sides had their lines anchored on the river, but on the northwestern flank, Artaxerxes' right or Cyrus' left, Artaxerxes could extend his line further than Cyrus and potentially try to envelop that flank, which will be a key consideration for Cyrus in this battle. Xenophon writes, quote, "At this point, Cyrus himself rode along the lines with Pygries, his interpreter, and 3 or 4 others, and shouted to Clearchus to lead his army toward the enemy's center, because that was where the king was. If we are victorious there, he said, we have achieved everything. Clearchus saw the dense mass in the center and heard from Cyrus that the king was beyond the Greek left wing, for the king was superior in numbers to such an extent that, though he held the center of his own troops, he was beyond Cyrus' left. But all the same, he did not want to draw his right away from the river, fearing that he might be encircled from both sides, and he answered Cyrus that he would take care that things went well. At this critical juncture, the barbarian army was advancing steadily, but the Greek army was still in the same place, forming its line from those who were still coming up. Cyrus rode along, not very close to his own army, observing the scene and looking in both directions, both at the enemy troops and at his own. Xenophon of Athens, seeing him from the Greek army, came forward a little to meet him and asked if he had any message to pass on. Cyrus halted and told him to say to everyone that the sacred signs from the main sacrifice were favorable, and the omens from the blood sacrifices were favorable too. As he said this, he heard a loud noise running through the ranks, and he asked what the noise was. Xenophon said that the watchword was now being passed along for the second time. Cyrus wondered on whose instruction this was being done, and he asked what the watchword was. Xenophon replied, "Zeus the Savior and victory." On hearing this, Cyrus said, "Well, I accept it, and let it be so." Having said this, he rode away to his own position. The 2 battle lines were now separated from each other by less than 600 or 800 yards when the Greeks started singing a war hymn and began to move against the enemy. As they proceeded on their way, a bulge appeared in the battle line, and those who were being left behind began to dash forward at a run. At the same time, they all cried out as if raising the battle cry to Enyalios, and all broke into a run. Some say they clashed their shields against their spears and startled the horses. When they were almost a bowshot away, the enemy broke and fled. Then, naturally enough, the Greeks set about the pursuit with all their might, although shouting to one another not to run headlong but to follow in formation. The chariots hurtled around, some among the enemy themselves, others, with no charioteers in them, among the Greeks too. Whenever they saw the chariots coming, they stood aside, but there was one soldier who was run down by a chariot, like someone on a racetrack in a daze. But they said that he was not injured in any way, nor were any of the other Greeks at all injured in this battle, except that on the left wing someone was said to have been shot by an arrow. End quote. Now that might sound incredible, that the Greeks could suffer almost no casualties at all. You might be tempted to think that's just Xenophon embellishing there, but it's actually not that crazy that that could happen. He says they were almost in bowshot when the enemy fled, which means they weren't even taking incoming arrows yet, except for maybe a few strays at extreme range. And even then, remember how heavily armored these guys were, so even if a few arrows did reach them, there's still a good chance nobody gets hurt. And then the enemy broke and ran before they even came into direct contact. The psychology of ancient armies in battle is just fascinating. When there's a major pitched battle like this, we know that unit cohesion was absolutely critical. These battles were most likely not like the movies where the 2 sides just charge at each other and there's a giant chaotic melee until one side wins somehow. No, ideally, you want to be fighting in one direction at a time. You have a shield that can only protect you on one side at a time. You have armor that mostly protects your front and doesn't give as much coverage in the back. So you want your front facing the enemy. And when you're facing the enemy, you want to be reasonably confident that there's nobody going to stab you from behind. You want your own men at your back and to your sides, and the enemy in front where your spear is pointing and where your shield is protecting you. And so units that have the discipline to maintain formation like this in battle are just going to be more effective than units that don't. And there's probably a case to be made that the reason the Greek hoplite phalanx was so good is that it was better than just about anybody else in its time at maintaining unit cohesion in battle. And this is where the psychology comes in, because while unit cohesion is obviously based in part on training and experience, it's also based heavily on morale. If you want to get a bunch of men to be willing to stand in formation, eyeball to eyeball with an enemy trying to stab them with 8-foot spears, well, those men probably have to believe that their own side can win the encounter. Because as we said before, most casualties would happen after one side broke and lost their cohesion, and most casualties would be inflicted on the losing side. And this belief and morale piece of unit cohesion really starts long before you get to the battlefield, especially if you have an idea of who you're going to be fighting before you get there. The reputation of your enemy can have a big effect on your own side's belief that they're able to come out on top, and therefore an effect on your own side's unit cohesion. In this case, these hapless Persians saw Greek hoplites in full armor charging down on them and broke before they ever came into contact. Now, I don't know for sure why they broke and ran. There's no real way to tell, but I can speculate pretty confidently that by this time in the history of Greco-Persian relations, the reputation of Greek hoplites was preceding them pretty much everywhere they went. You know, maybe these soldiers in Artaxerxes' army had heard old tales of Marathon and Thermopylae and Plataea, and they wanted no part of actually coming to grips with these tank-like Greek infantrymen. Whatever the case, they ran, and the Greeks came away with a pretty easy victory on their sector of the field. Meanwhile, Cyrus went into battle in the center. Xenophon continues, quote, Cyrus was pleased when he saw that the Greeks were victorious over those opposite them and were mounting a pursuit, and he was already having homage paid him as king by those around him, but he was not tempted to join the pursuit. Instead, accompanied by the unit of 600 cavalry that he had with him in close order, he was watching carefully for what the king was going to do, as he knew that he would be occupying the center of the Persian army. All the barbarian rulers lead their troops with themselves in the center, thinking that puts them in the safest position, with the strength of their forces on either side, and also that should they need to send some message, the army would learn what it is in half the time. The king, then, naturally occupied the center of his army on this occasion, and it was nevertheless beyond Cyrus' left. Since nobody was making a direct frontal attack on him, nor on those of his troops that were drawn up in front of him, he began to bend his line around to achieve an encirclement. At this, Cyrus, struck by the fear that Artaxerxes might get behind the Greek force and cut it to pieces, charged in the king's direction. Breaking into the enemy line with his 600 cavalry, he defeated the troops drawn up in front of the king and turned the 6,000 of them to flee, and it is said that he himself killed their commander, Artaxerxes, with his own hand. When the rout occurred, Cyrus' 600 started out in pursuit and spread out, except for a very small number that left with him, more or less his so-called table companions. Left on his own with them, he caught sight of the king and the mass of troops around him, and immediately his self-control vanished. Calling out, "I see the man," he rushed at the king and struck him in the chest, wounding him through his breastplate, as Ctesias the physician says, and he also says that he himself treated the wound. Someone threw a light spear with great force at Cyrus just as he struck the king, hitting Cyrus under the eye, and from that point the king and Cyrus and their respective entourages were all fighting together. How many of the king's entourage were killed is stated by Ctesias, who was with the king. On the other side, Cyrus himself was killed, and the best 8 of his supporters lay dead upon his corpse. It is said that when Artapatas, his most trusted companion in arms among the mace-bearers, saw that Cyrus had fallen, he leapt from his horse and threw himself on him. Some say that the king ordered someone to slay him on top of Cyrus, like a blood sacrifice. Others that he drew his ceremonial dagger and slew himself. His dagger was made of gold, and he used to wear a necklace and bracelets and other jewelry like the noblest of the Persians, for he was honored by Cyrus because of his goodwill toward him and his trustworthiness." End quote. Then, after giving a fairly lengthy eulogy for Cyrus, Xenophon continues, quote, "When Cyrus died, all the friends and table companions around him also died fighting on his behalf, though Artaxerxes was an exception. He happened to be posted on the left as commander of the cavalry, and when he realized that Cyrus had fallen, he took to flight, together with the entire force he was leading. Then Cyrus' head was cut off, and his right hand. The king, in his pursuit, broke into the Syrian camp, and the troops with Artaxerxes no longer stood firm but fled through their own camp to the overnight halt from which they had started out. People said that it was as much as 4 parasangs away. The king and those with him seized a large amount of plunder, notably Cyrus' Phocian concubine, who was said to be wise and beautiful. His Milesian concubine, the younger of the two, was captured by the king's entourage but succeeded in escaping, though undressed, to some of the Greeks in the baggage train who happened to have weapons and who, formed up in line against the plunderers, killed many of them, though some of them were also killed. In spite of this, they did not run off, but they saved her and also saved whatever other property and people were within their lines." End quote. So, to recap, the Greek hoplites in Cyrus' right center were victorious pretty easily. Meanwhile, Cyrus himself was killed in the center, after which the barbarian left wing of his army more or less disintegrated, leaving Artaxerxes free to plunder Cyrus' camp and baggage train. Now, the strange thing about some of these ancient battles, and I guess battles in general, is that you can get these situations where the outcome is radically different on 2 different sectors of the battlefield, but the winners on either sector don't really have any idea what's going on in the other sector. So the Greeks were now far advanced from where their original battle line was after their pursuit of the fleeing Persians in their sector. They had no idea Cyrus was dead, and they really didn't even know how the battle had gone on the other wing until they eventually figured out that the Persians were in their camp far in the rear. Likewise, the Persians on the other wing really had no idea how badly their comrades had been routed by the Greeks. Maybe Tissaphernes knew because he had actually led his cavalry in a charge directly along the riverside, driven through the Greek peltasts on that flank, and also found his way into the Greek camp, but his numbers were pretty small and he didn't end up playing that big of a role in this battle in the end. But it must have been fairly disconcerting for men on both sides to suddenly look around and realize that the enemy was in their rear. And this applied equally to both sides. The Greeks were in the Persian rear and the Persians were in the Greek rear. Xenophon says the Greeks anticipated that they would now have to about face and prepare to meet the Persians attacking them in the rear. But for whatever reason, maybe the Greek hoplite reputation, maybe something else, it seems that Artaxerxes was not particularly interested in another direct clash with Greek hoplites. The Greeks charged once more, the Persians broke and ran even faster and further than they did the first time, and after that, Artaxerxes decided to give them a wide berth and simply move around their northeast flank back to his original position. Then eventually he retreated to the southeast, back in the direction he'd come. And that was the Battle of Cunaxa. Cyrus was dead, which really made this whole expedition kaput, by the way. The reason for this army's existence was to install Cyrus on the throne of Persia, after all. But the Greeks didn't know any of that yet. From their perspective, they'd just won a great battle with ease. They didn't know exactly what had happened on the other wing, but despite the fact that there were Persians in the camp, they figured that since they hadn't heard from Cyrus yet, he must be off somewhere pursuing some segment of the enemy that had broken. And after all, at the end of the day, they stood in possession of the field, which by Greek customs meant victory. But the plunder of their camp also meant there was no immediate food supply to be had, and so they bedded down on the field hungry that night, and woke up hungry the next morning, still wondering what Cyrus was up to and why he hadn't given them any further orders yet. Now, sometime on that next day, the Greeks did figure out the predicament they were in. A couple of messengers from their Persian allies came into their lines and told them that Cyrus was dead, and also that Artaxerxes, the Persian commander of the left wing, had fled and regrouped with the survivors of his wing back at the army's resting place from the night before the battle. Now, what do you do if you're these Greek generals? Well, of course, they were a little bit rattled by this whole situation, but Clearchus, the Spartan general, being a Spartan, took the bull by the horns and made a very Spartan suggestion. He said, well, Cyrus might be dead, but we won the battle. I mean, we're in possession of the field, and there's nobody there to stand against us. So who's the next Persian in the chain of command? Artaxerxes? Well, we'll just make you king then, because, Clearchus said, quote, to those who conquer in battle belongs the power to rule. End quote. I really don't know where Clearchus' head was at with this, and unfortunately Xenophon doesn't really give any insight about it. Did he actually think putting Artaxerxes on the throne was a realistic possibility? Because I can't imagine that it would be. I mean, Cyrus' claim to the throne was that he was a son of Darius II. He also had the support of his mother, Parysatis, who favored him over her other son, Artaxerxes, and was apparently a serious force in Persian royal court politics. Artaxerxes was just some general. Clearly a high-ranking one in Cyrus' army, but I just find it pretty doubtful to think that he could have ever commanded the same support from Parysatis and other key figures that Cyrus did. And what's more, it seems to me that Clearchus should have known all this. He was clearly not a dumb guy. I mean, he's the one who had come up with that little ploy to get the Greeks to agree to continue on the expedition back when they first sussed out that they weren't just policing Pisidians. The only other possibility I can see is that Clearchus was working some kind of angle here, but I just don't really have any idea what it could have been. But anyway, the Greeks sent off the messengers back to Artaxerxes, offering to install him on the throne if he agreed to it. But before they got any word back on that, envoys from Artaxerxes showed up. Among them was a Greek named Phalanos, who ended up doing a lot of the negotiating coming up here. What they said was that Artaxerxes had claimed the victory because he'd killed his rival Cyrus, and he was now ordering the Greeks to lay down their weapons. Clearchus, of course, still maintained that the Greeks had won the battle and said basically that you don't surrender your weapons after a victory, so screw you guys. Then Proxenos, the Theban general and the friend of Xenophon who'd gotten him into this whole thing, spoke up and said, quote, well, Phalanos, for my part, I wonder whether the king is asking for our weapons on the basis that he is the conqueror or as gifts to be given to him out of friendship. For if he is the conqueror, why does he have to ask, rather than just come and take them? But if he wants to obtain them through persuasion, let him say what will be in it for the soldiers, if they do him this favor. End quote. And Phalanos responds to that, quote, the king regards himself as the victor since he killed Cyrus. And indeed, is there anyone to contest his rule with him? He also thinks that you belong to him, since he has caught you in the middle of his territory, between uncrossable rivers, and he can lead against you a multitude of people so large that you would not be able to kill them even if he gave you the opportunity. End quote. And this is the tension that will develop and influence so much of this story going forward. The Greeks were now 1,000 miles deep in Persian territory as the crow flies and had no friends to turn to, except for their Persian allies under Artaxerxes, and even they probably seemed a little bit iffy now that Cyrus was dead. Suffice it to say that their situation was not looking very good right now. But they still had one big trump card to play, which was the Greek hoplite reputation. Despite the situation they were in, Persians feared them, and they knew it. Just the day before, they had put a whole Persian army to flight without even coming to grips with them. So they had that going for them, and they also had the fact that their reputation was pretty well deserved. They absolutely were formidable fighters. And what's more, Artaxerxes knew that, and as we'll see, despite all the advantages he had in numbers and resources, he did not want to have to fight these Greeks straight up. So I think that's kind of what Proxenos was thinking here. He was like, well, if we were really in as bad of a spot as Artaxerxes wants us to think we are, he wouldn't need to try to negotiate to get us to lay down our weapons. he could just come and take them. That line of thought was enough to get the Greeks to start thinking that laying down their weapons was about the last thing they'd want to do right now. So after they refused to lay down their weapons, Phalanos told them the final order from the king, which was that the current truce would hold only as long as the Greeks stayed put where they were and didn't try to move until they laid down their weapons. If they moved, it would be open war. Clearchus was a little cagey about the response. He agreed to those terms, but didn't tell Phalanos which one he planned on doing. Then the Greeks kept their weapons, and Phalanos went back to the king to tell him how it went. Then the messengers came back from Artaxerxes saying that, predictably, the whole installing him as king idea was not going to work because he didn't have the support for it, but he was planning on leaving to march back to Ionia first thing the next morning, and the Greeks could come along if they wanted. And that's what Clearchus decided to do. Clearchus, by the way, was now the undisputed supreme commander of the 10,000, even though there wasn't really an official position of that nature, just commanders of the various contingents. Xenophon says, quote, "From then on, Clearchus acted as the commander, and they obeyed, not because they had elected him their commander, but because they saw that he alone understood what the commander must understand, while the others did not have enough experience." End quote. Having a good leader in a situation like this really is the most important thing, isn't it? I sure hope nothing bad happens to Clearchus. Then there's a little note that my edition says is an insert from a later scribe and not from Xenophon himself, but it gives a nice little picture of where things stood at this point. Quote, "Reckoning the route by which they went from Ephesus and Ionia as far as the battlefield, it turns out to be 93 days' march, 535 parasangs, about 1,825 miles. From the battlefield, they said it was about 40 miles to Babylon." End quote. Around midnight that same night, the Greeks made it back to the camp where Artaxerxes and his remaining Cyrus-allied Persians had regrouped. The Greeks and Artaxerxes took an oath of loyalty to each other because, as you might imagine, the Greeks were a little suspect of their Persian allies at this point. You know, who's to say Artaxerxes wouldn't try to betray them to Artaxerxes somehow as a way of getting back into his good graces and securing himself a position in the empire again? The next question was how to get back home, which was more complicated than you might imagine. Remember, there had been a pretty exhausting desert crossing on the way to the battle, where many pack animals had died and most of their food supplies had been consumed, and the army most likely couldn't cross the desert again with the food they had left, especially after having their camp plundered by Artaxerxes' army. So going back the way they'd come was out of the question, but Artaxerxes said he knew of a way that was longer but would avoid having to cross the desert again, and they could forage for food on the way. So they struck out north, away from the Euphrates. But Artaxerxes hadn't been idle, and it turned out he'd been maneuvering in the last day or two since the battle as well. By the following morning, at least some detachments of his army were bivouacked in the vicinity of some rural villages directly in the path of the Greeks, and the Greeks sort of blundered into them. But again, the Greek reputation for battle prowess preceded them, and whatever elements of the king's army were there fled before even forming up for battle. But then later that night, Xenophon tells us that a panic descended over the Greek camp. He doesn't say what the panic was about. It's possible he didn't even know. It's possible almost nobody in the army really knew. This was just one of those tense situations where everybody is kind of keyed up and on edge, and it could be that somebody just heard something go bump in the night, started seeing ghosts and freaked out. The guys next to him start freaking out too, and next thing you know, there's a panic threatening to take over the whole army. And regardless of what started it, or how real of a threat it might have been, the panic itself is a major threat to the army. And again, Clearchus showed his leadership ability in how he handled it. Xenophon writes, quote, "Clearchus ordered Ptolemies of Elis, the best herald of his day, who was, as it happened, in his quarters, to call for silence, and proclaimed that the generals had an announcement to make, that whoever gave information as to who had let the donkey loose among the weapon stacks would receive a talent of silver as a reward. When the herald made this proclamation, the soldiers realized that their fears were empty and the officers were safe." End quote. So just have the herald tell everybody that a donkey had started all the commotion, and that got everybody to calm down. The next day, envoys arrived from Artaxerxes proposing a truce, which is quite a change of tune for Artaxerxes given that just a couple days ago he'd told the Greeks that it would be open war if they moved from the battlefield without first handing over their weapons. It seems that for all the advantages he had, Artaxerxes really didn't want to have to fight these guys in open battle. His threat hadn't worked, so now he was going to try diplomacy. Although the Greek soldiers were exhausted and hungry, Clearchus played a little hard to get in these negotiations. He wanted to appear strong and therefore didn't want to look too eager to accept a truce. But in the end, he did accept it, partially because it would give the Greeks a chance to replenish their food supplies from these Babylonian villages. They did so, and several days later, a Persian delegation led by Tissaphernes arrived from the king wanting to find out exactly where the Greeks stood and what their intentions were. Tissaphernes said that he'd called in a favor from the king. He had been the first to tell Artaxerxes about Cyrus' rebellion after all, and asked his permission to escort the Greeks safely back to their homeland. He said he considered the Greeks neighbors, since his homeland was pretty close to a bunch of Greek cities, and he felt it his duty to help them out in this touchy situation. In response, Clearchus gave about the most thorough description of the Greek position and their thinking around strategy at this point that we've seen so far. Quote, "We did not gather together to make war on the king, nor did we make our way to the interior to attack him. On the contrary, Cyrus found many pretexts, as you too know well, in order to take you unprepared and to bring us here. However, when we eventually saw that he was in a terrible position, shame in the sight of the gods and of mankind kept us from betraying him, because we had in former times been willing recipients of his largesse. But since Cyrus is dead, we are not contesting the king's right to rule, nor do we have any reason to wish to harm the king's territory, and we would not want to kill him but would just make our way home unless someone harasses us. However, if anyone wrongs us, we will try to defend ourselves against him, with the aid of the gods. But if anyone takes the initiative in benefiting us, we will not be outdone by him in conferring benefits, up to the very limit of our ability." End quote. Well, Tissaphernes brought that news back to Artaxerxes and returned saying that the king had agreed to the terms. The Greeks would be allowed to march back home in peace, they'd be provided with a market to buy food anywhere they stopped, and when it wasn't possible to provide a market, they'd be allowed to forage. And this would hold as long as they didn't make any aggressive move against the king or cause any wanton destruction on their route of march. They swore an oath on it. Then Tissaphernes said, "All right, wait here, I'm going to go back to the king, let him know we made this truce, make my preparations, and then I'll come back to lead you out." But then Tissaphernes didn't come back for more than 3 weeks, which was a long time given how quick he'd come back from visiting the king the first time. While he was gone, Xenophon says that Artaxerxes started to maybe become a little more distant from the Greeks. He and the other Persian allies started getting visitors from their Persian friends, some of them apparently trying to make nice between them and the king, which obviously made the Greeks suspicious. They started to wonder if, instead of preparing to lead them out, Tissaphernes was preparing some kind of trap for them. But Clearchus was set on seeing this through and trusting Tissaphernes, mostly because he didn't see any other choice at this point. Xenophon reports him as having said this to the other Greek officers, quote, "I too am concerned about all this and more, but on the other hand, I bear in mind that if we go away now, it will seem that we are departing to carry on the war, and that we are acting in breach of the truce. Other points are, first, that nobody will provide us with a market, nor is there anywhere from which we can obtain any food. Next, that there will be no one to act as a guide. On top of that, as soon as we do this, Artaxerxes will immediately cease to support us. So then we shall have no friend left, but even those who were friends previously will become our enemies. Whether there is also some other river that we must cross, I don't know, but we do know that the Euphrates is impossible to cross when there are enemies there to prevent it. And of course, if we did have to fight at all, there would be no cavalry to support us, while the enemy's cavalry is very numerous and should be rated very highly. So if we were victorious, whom would we manage to kill? Yet if we were defeated, none of us would survive. Therefore, if the king, with so many circumstances working for him, does intend to destroy us, I for my part don't know why he would need to swear an oath, proffer his right hand, perjure himself by the gods and make his assurances of good faith untrustworthy in the eyes of Greeks and barbarians alike." End quote. Eventually, Tissaphernes did come back, and apparently led them on just like he'd promised to do. But he led them in a strange direction, at least from the Greek perspective. Instead of continuing north and northwest, he led them back south, towards the battlefield of Cunaxa, back into that narrow neck of land between the two rivers, and seemingly the opposite direction of where the Greeks would want to be going. They crossed the Median Wall going south, then turned east and crossed the Tigris on a pontoon bridge. Now, given what is about to happen, it makes perfect sense why Tissaphernes and the Persians would want the Greeks on the far side of the Tigris. The Tigris is a pretty big river. You can't cross it without boats or a bridge, and therefore it would end up posing a serious obstacle to the Greeks trying to march back west once the coming events go down. What makes less sense to me is why the Greeks would go along with being led in the wrong direction, and unfortunately Xenophon doesn't really give us any insight about this. It is clear that they absolutely were suspicious of Tissaphernes, but as Clearchos explained a minute ago, they didn't seem to really have any choice but to trust him and go where he led. But even so, I mean, if you're already suspicious of the guy and then he starts leading you in the opposite direction from where you'd want to be going, it seems like you might want to just change your mind at that point and say, "We're out, we'll fend for ourselves, and if that means war, then you'll have to come get us." Because Tissaphernes never explained to the Greeks why he was taking them this way, at least not that Xenophon records. But at the end of the day, whatever combination of inertia, misplaced trust, and sheer lack of other options was bouncing around in Clearchos' head led him to keep following Tissaphernes to the far side of the Tigris, putting another major obstacle between the Greeks and the route home. To make matters worse, tensions were mounting between the Greeks and their Persian allies in Araios' camp. Xenophon says this started with the suspicions during the wait for Tissaphernes and then grew during their march to the Tigris. He writes, quote, "The Greeks were suspicious of them and journeyed with their own guides, keeping to themselves. The two parties would make camp separately, a parasang and more apart. Both were on their guard against the other, as if they were enemies, and this immediately created more suspicion. Sometimes when they were gathering wood from the same place or collecting fodder and other such things, they came to blows, and this too provoked enmity." End quote. After crossing the Tigris, the Greeks and their tenuous Persian allies marched up the east bank for several weeks with no further incident, although suspicions were running high the whole time. Eventually they came to the Zapatas River, a tributary of the Tigris, and camped for 3 days before crossing it, which is where everything went to hell. You know that fable of the scorpion and the frog? In case you haven't heard it before, it goes like this. A scorpion wants to cross a river, but he can't swim because he's a scorpion. While he sits there wondering what to do, a frog hops by on his way into the river. The scorpion says, "Hey frog, will you carry me across the river?" The frog says, "No, of course not. You're a scorpion. You'll sting me." The scorpion says, "Well, if I stung you in the middle of the river, I'd die too because I can't swim." The frog thinks for a minute and finally says, "Well, I'm still a little suspicious, but that makes some sense. Yeah, I guess I'll take you across the river." Well, the scorpion hops on the frog's back, and the frog starts paddling. They get out into the middle of the river, and sure enough, the scorpion stings the frog. As the frog starts to die, it says to the scorpion, "What the hell did you do that for? Now you're going to die too, you idiot." And the scorpion says, "Yeah, I'm really sorry, but I just couldn't help it. I'm a scorpion. I have to sting. It's in my nature." Then the frog dies and the scorpion drowns in the river. The moral of that story is usually said to be a warning about how there are certain types of people who are vicious enough that they'll hurt other people even to their own detriment. It's a pretty good lesson and one that many of us today could stand to take to heart, but if you think about it specifically from the frog's point of view, it could be a slightly different kind of cautionary tale. See, the frog knows he can't trust a scorpion. Of course he can't trust a scorpion. It's a scorpion after all. The frog knows he can't trust the scorpion, but he trusts the scorpion anyway, wrongly thinking that the scorpion's own self-interest will protect him too. Now, in case it's not obvious by now, Clearchus is the frog in this analogy and Tissaphernes is the scorpion. To add some weight to Clearchus' perspective on this and be a little charitable to him, he has a lot more reason to trust Tissaphernes than the frog has to trust the scorpion, namely necessity. The frog doesn't have to take the scorpion across the river. He just decides to do it for the sake of doing a favor for a stranger. Clearchus, on the other hand, has all the previously stated reasons for trusting Tissaphernes, or at least going along with him until he comes up with a better option. But Clearchus' fatal mistake was that he judged Tissaphernes as the lesser risk compared to just declaring open war on the Persians and marching home on his own. As we're about to see, he almost couldn't have been more wrong in that judgment, because Tissaphernes was about to sting. Clearchus by this point was suspicious enough of the Persians that he decided to go directly to Tissaphernes and try to iron the whole thing out, which seems absurd to me. I mean, you're going to go to the person who you should be the most suspicious of and try to get reassurances from them. It's kind of like if you had a business partner you suspected of stealing from you or something, and you went directly to that person for reassurance that they're not stealing from you. Well, if they're guilty, of course they're going to do everything they can to convince you that they're not guilty because they want to keep stealing from you. But to my reading of this, it seems to me like Clearchus had started to break by this point. It was a heavy responsibility leading this army under these circumstances, surrounded by enemies as they were. I'd imagine the pressure would get to just about anybody. Then you add in all this suspicion of the Persians who just a couple months ago were fighting alongside you and are still supposedly your allies, and maybe the pressure just got to Clearchus a little too much, and he was desperate for some reassurance. So he went to Tissaphernes. Now I'm going to end up reading a lot from Xenophon here, which I feel justified in doing because it is his story after all, but I'm doing it because I really think it's best to hear what's coming directly from the mouths of the people speaking the words, or at least as Xenophon reports them having spoken the words. Clearchus went from the Greek camp to the Persian one to meet Tissaphernes, and this is what Xenophon records him as having said. Quote, Tissaphernes, I know on my side that oaths have been made between us, and pledges of good faith given that we shall not wrong each other, but I see that you are on guard against us like enemies, and since we see this, we in turn are on guard against you. But since, when I look into it, I cannot detect that you are trying to do us harm, and I know clearly that we, at any rate, do not have anything of this kind in mind ourselves, I decided to come to you to discuss the situation, in order to eradicate the distrust between us if we could. For I have also known people in the past who become afraid of one another, whether through slander or merely through becoming suspicious, and in their wish to strike first before they became the victim, they inflicted irreparable harm on those who neither intended nor indeed wanted to do anything of the kind. So thinking that such misunderstandings would best be ended if we met personally, I have come here, and I want to show you that you are not right to distrust us. First and foremost, the oaths we swore to the gods prevent us from being enemies to each other. To my mind, no one conscious of having disregarded these could be at all happy. For I am well aware that in a war with the gods, no speed would be sufficient to permit a fugitive to escape, no place would be dark enough for him to steal off and hide, and he would have no possibility of removing himself to a secure stronghold. All things are subject to the gods in every way, and the gods rule everything and everywhere alike. That's what I know about the gods and about oaths, in whose care we deposited the friendship we made with each other. And as for human considerations, I for my part think that in our present situation you are an extremely good thing for us. With you the whole route is easy to travel, every river is passable, there is no shortage of food supplies. Without you, we traveled a route in the dark, as we don't know it at all. Every river is difficult to cross, every crowd of people is fearsome. But most fearsome of all is solitude, for it is replete with all sorts of shortages. Indeed, supposing that in some fit of madness we did slay you, that would be nothing other than slaying our benefactor and then entering a contest against the king himself, the most effective reserve of all. There are many causes for hope, and of many different kinds, of which I would obviously be depriving myself if I were to try to do you any harm. I will set them out. I set my heart upon Cyrus becoming a friend to me because I thought that he was in the best position of anyone at that time to do good to someone if he wanted to, But I now see that you have the power and the lands of Cyrus and have also preserved your own, while the power of the king, which Cyrus found hostile, is to you an ally. Since this is the situation, who would be so mad as to not want to be your friend? But, in fact, I will say something else, which gives me hope that you too will want to be friends with us. I know that the Mysians are troublesome to you, and I think with my present forces I could humble them for you. I also know that the Pisidians are troublesome, and I hear that there are many other tribes of that sort, and I think I could stop them from being a constant obstacle to your prosperity. And then there are the Egyptians, with whom I understand that you have become especially infuriated recently. I do not see what forces you might prefer to use as your ally in punishing them rather than those I currently have with me. But indeed, just considering your immediate neighbors, if you were to wish to be a friend of any of them, what a very great friend you would be if we were in your service, and if anyone else were to annoy you, how you could play the master over them. We would not serve you only for the sake of the pay, but also because of the gratitude we would rightly have toward you because we would have been saved by you. When I reflect on all these points, your distrust for us seems so remarkable that it would be with great pleasure that I would hear his name, the name of the person who is so clever a talker that he has persuaded you with his tales of our plots against you." End quote. This is a far cry from the Clearchus that was playing hard to get in negotiations and telling Artaxerxes to come and take them when ordered to give up his weapons just a couple months ago, right? Now he's trying to justify himself to Tissaphernes, giving him all the reasons why Tissaphernes shouldn't be suspicious of him, and trying to sell his army's services when really he should be worried about being betrayed. Tissaphernes responded, quote, "How pleased I am, Clearchus, to hear such prudent words from you, for if you were to plan some evil against me when you recognize all this, by that very fact you would seem to me to be demonstrating evil intent against yourself. Take your turn in listening, and you will learn that any distrust of the king or of me on the part of you Greeks would not be fair. If we wanted to destroy you, do we seem to you to be short of sufficient cavalry or infantry or military equipment to have the capacity to harm you without there being any danger of our suffering any reprisal? Or perhaps we seem to you to be lacking in places suitable to launch attacks on you. Don't you see how extensive are the plains across which you are making your way with such great toil even when they are friendly? How high are the mountains over which your way necessarily lies, which we could occupy in advance and render impassable to you? And how many are the rivers on whose banks we could regulate how many of you at a time we might want to fight? There are some of them that you would not manage to cross at all if we did not convey you over. If we came off worse in all these places, still, at any rate, fire assuredly masters harvest, and by burning down all the crops we could put starvation in the battle line against you. Even though you may be very good at fighting, you could not fight against that. So with so many ways to wage war against you, none of which involve danger for us, how then could we possibly choose to destroy you by the one method of all of these that is impious in the eyes of the gods and disgraceful in the eyes of mankind? It is among those who are altogether without resources, with no other devices available to them, and in the grip of necessity, and they would have to be worthless as well, that there are people who want to achieve something through perjury to the gods and deceit to mankind. No, Clearchus, we are not so irrational or so foolish. But why then, since it is possible to destroy you, did we not go ahead and do so? You should be aware that the reason we did not is my intense desire to become trustworthy in the eyes of the Greeks. Where Cyrus went up to the interior trusting in his foreign troops because of the pay he was giving them, I long to go back down to the coast, strengthened by your support because of the good deeds I am doing for your sake. You yourself have mentioned some of the respects in which you and your troops are useful to me, but I myself know the greatest. For only the king can wear the tiara upright on his head, but perhaps another, with your assistance, might readily wear it upright in his heart." End quote. I should clarify what he's talking about right there at the end. The tiara is a type of traditional Persian headwear, and traditionally to wear it in a particular manner, namely upright on the head, would be a symbol of royalty and the prerogative of the king only. So when Tissaphernes says that if the Greeks fight for him, he might be able to wear the tiara upright in his heart, he's saying something like, maybe I could be the great king in everything but name, basically. That he'd have greater power than just about anybody else in Persia and would know in his heart that he's the king in spirit. Anyway, this is such a great villain speech from Tissaphernes. He gives a bunch of reasons that would definitely be convincing to Clearchus, who is desperate to be convinced of Tissaphernes' good faith. But at the same time, the whole thing comes off as a subtle threat, like he's saying, yeah, you better not try anything, otherwise we'll destroy you. As for the actual reason why the king wouldn't have destroyed the Greeks already if that's what he intended to do, we've already seen it. He knows they're a formidable fighting force, and he doesn't want to have to fight them in open war if he doesn't have to. He'd much rather do the job by subterfuge. A pitched battle with the Greeks is probably going to be rough. Best case scenario, Artaxerxes has to spend a lot of his own soldiers' lives trying to destroy them, and he'd rather not have to do that. Worst case, his army just runs again like it did from the Greeks at Cunaxa, and that's not good either. Tissaphernes is right that the Greeks would have a hell of a time trying to march home without Persian guides and goodwill, but what if instead they just found some strong, defensible place to hole up? If they did that, they could end up being a thorn in the king's side for quite a long time. The scorched earth strategy would be effective at starving the Greeks out for sure, but that would be incredibly painful for the Persians too, so that's kind of a last resort. At the end of the day, it's not hard to see why the king and Tissaphernes would decide on the course they were about to take with the Greeks. Clearchus apparently was not thinking this way because he just took Tissaphernes' word for it that he was acting in good faith. He told Tissaphernes, well, now we should get together and punish whoever has been spreading these rumors that we're going to betray each other. Tissaphernes said, absolutely, that's a great idea. Tell you what, Clearchus, why don't you go back to your camp, get all of your top generals together, bring them over here to the Persian camp, and I'll expose the rumor spreaders to all of you. And Clearchus did it. Over the strong objections of many of his officers, I might add. Xenophon says that 5 generals, 20 captains, and about 200 regular soldiers went back to the Persian camp with him. And Xenophon writes about what happened. Quote, when they reached Tissaphernes' threshold, the generals were called inside. Proxenos of Boeotia, Menon of Thessaly, Aegeus of Arcadia, Clearchus of Laconia, Socrates of Achaia. Meanwhile, the captains waited at the entrance. Not long afterward, at a single signal, the Greeks inside were all arrested and the Greeks outside cut down. After this, some of the barbarian cavalry rode across the plain, killing every Greek, whether slave or free, whom they came across. As the Greeks looked out from their camp, they wondered at the cavalry's movements and were puzzled about what was happening until Nicarchos of Arcadia arrived in flight. He had been wounded in the belly and held his guts in his hands, and he told them all that had happened. At this, the Greeks naturally ran for their weapons. All of them were astonished and thought that the enemy would immediately come to attack the camp. But they did not all come. Only Artaxerxes and Artaxerxes and Mithridates, who had been Cyrus' most trusted companions. The person acting as interpreter for the Greeks said he also saw and recognized Tissaphernes' brother with them. Other Persians in armor followed along, as many as 300. When they were close, they gave orders that if any of the Greeks was a general or a captain, he should approach, in order that he might be given the king's message. After this, Cleonor of Orchomenos and Sophonatos of Stymphalos came out cautiously in the capacity of generals, and with them came Xenophon of Athens, in order to find out what had happened to Proxenos. Chrysophos happened to be away at the time in some village with other troops, foraging. They took up a stand within hearing distance, and Artaxerxes spoke as follows. Quoting Artaxerxes now, men of Greece, since Clearchus has been revealed as a perjurer and a truce breaker, justice has been done to him, and he is dead. But Proxenos and Menon, by contrast, because they denounced his plot, are held in great honor. As for you, the king demands your weapons, since he says they belong to him, especially as they previously belonged to Cyrus, his slave. Then Cleonor the Orchomenian responded, Artaxerxes, you worst of people, and those of you others who were friends of Cyrus, you who swore to us that you would acknowledge the same friends and enemies as we do, are you not ashamed before the gods and before mankind to have betrayed us and sided with Tissaphernes, that most godless and wicked person? You have destroyed the very men to whom you swore your oaths, and you have betrayed the rest of us as well by advancing against us in company with the enemy. Then Artaxerxes responded, It has become clear that Clearchus has for a long time been plotting against Tissaphernes and Orontas and against all of us who are associated with them. Then Xenophon reports that he spoke up himself and said, "If indeed it is true that Clearchus was breaking the truce, contrary to his oaths, he has received justice, for it is just for perjurers to be wiped off the face of the earth. But Proxenos and Menon are both your benefactors and our generals, so send them here. It's clear that since they are on friendly terms, as you say, with both sides, they will try to give the best advice both to you and to us." And back to the narrative. In response to this, the barbarians spoke among themselves for a long time, and then went away without giving any answer. The generals then, having been arrested by these means, were carried off to the king and met their end by being beheaded. End quote. Xenophon gives obituaries for all 5 generals who were killed in this way, but I'll just read you the one for Proxenos, who I'll remind you was the friend who invited Xenophon to come on this expedition in the first place. He writes, quote, "From his earliest youth, Proxenos the Boeotian wanted to become a man capable of achieving great things, and because of this desire he paid fees to Gorgias the Leontine. Since he had kept company with Gorgias, he thought that he was already capable of acting as a commander, and that friendly with leading people as he was, the benefit he could provide them would be at least as much as any good they did for him, and so he embarked on this affair of Cyrus. He thought he would thereby obtain a great name, great power, and much wealth. But though he very much desired these things, he also made it quite clear that he would not wish to obtain any of them with the aid of wrongdoing. He thought that it was necessary to achieve them in company with justice and honor, and not otherwise. He was capable of commanding good and honorable people, but by contrast he was not capable of instilling respect or fear toward himself in the ordinary soldiers. On the contrary, he stood in awe of his soldiers rather more than those under his command did of him, and it was clear he was more afraid of being disliked by his soldiers than his soldiers were of disobeying him. He thought that in order to be and to appear to be fit for command, it was sufficient to praise those who acted well and to abstain from praising those who did wrong. As a result, the good and honorable people among his associates were well disposed toward him, but the wrongdoers used to plot against him, thinking him easy to manipulate. When he died, he was about 30. End quote. So, if you remember back in Cilicia, one of the considerations for the Greeks continuing on the march with Cyrus was that it would be incredibly difficult to march 400 miles through Persian territory without the sanction of the Persian head honcho in the area, who at that time was Cyrus. Now, not only were they more than double that distance inside Persian territory, not only were they without the sanction of any Persian leadership for being there, not only were they completely without Persian allies, but just to put the little cherry on top of this shit sandwich, they just lost all of their own top leadership. And, might I remind you, these guys were mercenaries. They never cared about the cause of this war in the first place, besides the fact that Cyrus was going to pay them. And now that wasn't going to happen either. And this is exactly the play for Tissaphernes and the king. What they'd just done was cut off the head of the Greek army. They figured that best case scenario, the Greeks would be despondent enough without their generals that they'd just surrender and they wouldn't have to fight him at all. Or if they did still have to fight, their morale and unit cohesion would be weakened enough that it wouldn't be such a tall order to go toe-to-toe with the hoplites. And it was a good strategy. Xenophon tells us that the Greeks were despondent once they figured out what had happened. He writes, quote, "Since the generals had been arrested, and those of the captains and ordinary soldiers who had followed along with them had perished, the Greeks were in very great perplexity. They were at the very doors of the great king, they reflected, and all around them were many different peoples and cities hostile to them. Nobody was going to provide them with a market any longer, and they were separated from Greece by no less than 1,000 miles. They had no guide to show them the route, and there were rivers, impossible to cross, that barred the way home. Furthermore, the barbarians who had come up from the coast with Cyrus had also betrayed them, and they were alone by themselves, abandoned without a single horseman to act in support. Because of which it was quite clear that if they won a victory, they would still not manage to kill a single enemy, but if they had the worst of it, none of them would escape with their lives. With these thoughts in their mind and with heavy hearts, few of them touched their meal for the evening, and few kindled fires. Many did not come into the camp that night, each individual instead trying to take his rest where he happened to be. But they were unable to sleep because of their distress, and longing for their native lands and their parents, wives, and children whom they thought they would never see again. It was in this state of mind that they all tried to take their rest." End quote. Now, I should say a little bit about this lack of cavalry because it's come up several times now. Cavalry is the exploitation arm, traditionally. We talked earlier about the shoving match that was ancient hoplite warfare and how most of the casualties were typically inflicted in the retreat after one side broke. Well, horses are faster than men on foot, and traditionally the cavalry would be the arm that pursues the fleeing enemy, kills them, and makes sure they're not going to be able to regroup and attack you again. It turns out the Greeks had no cavalry in their army, which meant they lacked that exploitation and pursuit arm. All the cavalry in Cyrus' army had been Persians, and those guys were hostile now. To make matters worse for the Greeks, they were mostly hoplites, heavy infantry. If you're hoplites fighting lighter-armed troops, that's really good for you if you're trying to hold the line. You're probably going to win that shoving match every time. But the problem is, after the enemy breaks and runs, they're lighter than you without all that heavy armor and equipment weighing them down, which means they're most likely faster than you, and you're going to have a hard time pursuing them and inflicting casualties after they break. So without a cavalry arm, it was going to be tough for the Greeks to actually do enough damage to the enemy to deter future attacks. They could probably hold off the first attack pretty easily, and the second and the third, probably for a good long while if their cohesion held. But the problem is the Persians could just keep attacking and attacking and attacking, rotating in fresh troops all the time, wearing the Greeks down. And once they were worn down through that grind, it seemed like just a matter of time before they'd break unless they figured out something else in a hurry. When they broke, they'd have nowhere to run, and the Persians did not suffer the same lack of cavalry that the Greeks did. The Persians were famous for their cavalry. It was traditionally the strongest part of their army at this time. So the Greeks were despondent, as I'd imagine anyone would be in this situation. And remember that anecdote I read earlier about how Xenophon came to be with the army when he was invited by Proxenos, and he had that whole thing with Socrates and the oracle at Delphi? Well, this is actually the point in the story where he chooses to tell you that, which is interesting. It's almost like he's saying, I didn't take Socrates' advice, and look where it got me. And this is where the story really gets good, honestly. I'll let Xenophon tell it himself. He writes, quote, "At this time of perplexity, Xenophon was distressed just like the others and was unable to sleep. But when by luck he managed a little bit of sleep, he had a dream. It seemed to him that there was a clap of thunder, and a lightning stroke fell in his ancestral home, and as a result the whole house was ablaze with light. Greatly afraid, he woke up immediately. He judged the dream a good one in one way, because in the midst of troubles and dangers, he had seemed to see a great light from Zeus. But looking at it from another point of view, he was also fearful, because the dream seemed to him to come from Zeus the king, and the fire seemed to be blazing all around. This made him afraid that he might not get out of the land of the king, but be penned in on all sides by various difficulties. Now, what such a dream really means can be seen from what happened after it, which was as follows. First of all, the moment he woke up, the thought struck him." And now he quotes his own internal monologue. "Why am I lying down? The night is far advanced, and it is likely that along with the day will come the enemy. If we fall into the hands of the king, what is to stop us from having to behold all the most grievous sights imaginable, from suffering all the most terrible torments, and from dying in the course of humiliating maltreatment? Nobody is making preparations or paying attention to how we may defend ourselves, but instead we are lying around as if it were possible to live in peace and quiet. Take me, for example. From what city am I expecting the general to come to take action here? What age am I waiting to reach? For I shall not grow any older if I hand myself over to the enemy today." And back to the main narrative. With this, he stood up and called together, first of all, those who had acted as captains for Proxenos. End quote. So Xenophon gets a literal lightning bolt from Zeus in a dream, which he interprets as meaning, "Hey, wake up, motherfucker, what are you doing? Are you just going to wait here to die?" And that's his impetus to do what he does next. And remember, Xenophon was not a general in this army or an officer of any kind. By all accounts, it was not his responsibility to organize anything, get the army on their feet, come up with a strategy, none of that. He makes that comment there about what age he's waiting for, and a footnote in my edition takes this as evidence that he was not quite 30 years old at this time. Because in Athens, 30 was the minimum age where a guy could take on certain civic jobs and responsibilities, including being a general. So he maybe wasn't even officially old enough to be a general yet. But Clearchus was gone, along with all the other top generals, and nobody else was doing anything. Somebody had to, otherwise they were all just going to die in the morning, or maybe get sold off into slavery or something. So he started with the captains who'd been serving under his friend Proxenos, which makes sense. If he'd been traveling near Proxenos most of the time, he probably had the closest contact and the best rapport with these guys out of anybody in the army. And again, I'm going to quote a lot here, but I think it's worth it because there's some really good speeches in this book. Xenophon said to the captains of Proxenos, quote, "Brave captains, speaking for myself, I am unable to sleep, and the same is true of you, I imagine. Nor can I continue lying down when I see the situation we are in. It is clear that the enemy did not reveal their hostile intent until they thought their own position was fully prepared. But in response to this, none of us is taking any thought at all as to how we shall carry on the struggle as honorably as possible. And yet if we give in and come into the hands of the king, what treatment do we think we shall receive? This is someone who, even when it was his own brother, born of the same mother, and already dead, cut off his head and his hand and impaled them. While as for us, in whose case there is no protector at hand, and who campaigned against Artaxerxes with the aim of making him a slave instead of a king, and of killing him if we could, what would you think we shall suffer? Under the circumstances, wouldn't he go to any length, such as torturing us in the most extreme way, to instill in all mankind a fear of ever campaigning against him? Rather than that, we have to do everything we can to avoid coming into his hands. In fact, as long as there was a truce, I myself never stopped lamenting our position and looking upon the king and those with him as supremely fortunate. I fully saw how extensive and how prosperous is the land they control, how abundant are their food supplies, how many retainers they have, how many livestock, how much gold, how much clothing. And on the other hand, whenever I brought to mind the circumstances of our soldiers, I was all too well aware that we have no share in any of these good things unless we purchase it, and I knew that few of us still have what it would cost us, and furthermore that our oaths now prevented us from acquiring food supplies in any other way than buying them. So, analyzing the situation like this, I was sometimes more afraid of the truce than I am now of open war. However, since these people have broken the truce, it seems to me that their arrogant willfulness and our perplexity have both come to an end. Those good things now lie between us like prizes in a competition about who prove to be the better men, we or they, a competition in which the gods are the umpires, and the gods, it seems likely, will be on our side. For these people have sworn false oaths by them, whereas, though we could see all this plentiful beauty, we kept rigidly clear of it because of our own oaths to the gods. And so it seems to me that we can go into the contest with far greater confidence than these people can. What's more, our bodies are better able than theirs to bear cold and heat and hard work, and with the gods on our side, our spirits are better, and their men are more exposed to wounds and death than we are, if the gods continue to give us victory as they did before. But as perhaps others are also having the same thoughts, in heaven's name let us not wait for other people to approach us and summon us to perform noble deeds. Let us ourselves take the lead in rousing the others to reveal their worth. Show yourselves to be the best of the captains, and deserve more to be generals than the generals themselves. As for me, if you want to make the first move towards these goals, I am willing to follow you. But if you assign me the post of leader, I do not make the age I am an excuse for refusing it, but think I am actually at the best time of life for warding off the evils that press on me." End quote. So his argument to the captains is that the situation is clarified now. Tissaphernes is no longer pretending to be their friend, so the option of trusting him is completely off the table. I'm reminded of what Colonel Chesty Puller said at the Frozen Chosen during the Korean War in 1950. "We've been looking for the enemy for some time now. We finally found him. We're surrounded. That simplifies things." For the Greeks, this did simplify things. There wasn't any calculation to be made anymore about the risk of trusting Tissaphernes versus the risk of going off on their own. They were on their own, whether they liked it or not, and the choices were clear. Sit here, do nothing, and die, or find something else to do on their own. To put an exclamation point on that, one of the captains, a guy named Apollonides from Boeotia, still argued that the Greeks should go to the king and try to solve this through diplomacy. And Xenophon spoke to him as follows, quote, "You most extraordinary person, you do not understand what you see or remember what you hear. Yet you too, just like these others, were right there when the king, after Cyrus' death, puffing himself up on that account, sent an order to us to hand over our weapons. And when we did not hand them over, but, fully prepared for battle, went and took up our quarters next to him, what did he not do, sending ambassadors and asking for truces and providing food supplies, until he obtained a truce? But when the generals and captains trusted in the truce and went unarmed to talks with them, just as you are now telling us to do, isn't their situation now that, beaten, tormented, and subjected to outrages, they are not even allowed to die, though I should think that they very much long for death in their misery? Knowing all this, how can you say that those who tell you to defend yourself are talking nonsense, while you tell us to go back again and try persuasion? Men, I think we should not admit this fellow into our ranks, but should deprive him of his captaincy, pile baggage on his back, and use him in that capacity. He disgraces his native country and all Greece because of the sort of person he is, despite being a Greek." End quote. And to make no bones about what they thought of this appeasement idea, the other captains there decided to not only strip Apollonides of his captaincy, but to boot him out of the camp completely. He was gone, banished, left to fend for himself. They'd already made up their mind. We're getting through this somehow, together. That's going to require all of us pulling in the same direction, and there has to be zero tolerance for any kind of dissent in the army. The other captains also elected the young Xenophon, who wasn't even supposed to be on this expedition as part of the regular army, to be their leader and representative. The next step was to take this resistance idea to the rest of the army, starting with the officers, and come up with a concrete plan. To that end, Proxenos' captains went through the camp, found all the surviving officers they could, and assembled them. Then, with their support, Xenophon addressed the assembled officers. Quote, "Now, we all, of course, know that the king and Tissaphernes seized those of us whom they could, and it is clear that they are plotting against the rest of us in order to destroy us if they can. We, on our side, in my opinion, must do everything conceivable to avoid falling into the hands of the barbarians. On the contrary, we must work to have them in our power if we can ever achieve it. In the light of this, you should be well aware that you who have now gathered together in such numbers have a very great opportunity. The soldiers here all have their gaze fixed on you, and if they see you being faint-hearted, they will all be cowardly. But if you show yourselves to be making preparations against the enemy, and you summon the others to join you, there's no doubt about it. They will follow you and try to imitate you. Perhaps indeed it is only fair for you to excel them to some extent. You are generals, you are group commanders and captains, and when there was peace, you claimed a larger share of riches and honors than they did. Consequently, now, when there is war, it is necessary to expect you to be better than the crowd, to devise plans before they do, and to be foremost in hard work if any is needed anywhere. Right now, first and foremost, I think that you would be doing a great service to the army if you were to take steps as quickly as possible to replace the generals and captains who have perished. For without leaders, nothing either honorable or beneficial could be accomplished anywhere at all, to put it bluntly, and in warfare this is particularly true. Good order, it seems, saves people, while lack of order has already destroyed many. When you have appointed as many officers as necessary, I think you would be acting very opportunely if you then assembled the rest of the soldiers and put some spirit into them. For perhaps you too notice, as things stand, how listlessly they came into camp, how listlessly they went on guard. While they are in this frame of mind, I do not know what use anyone could make of them, whether the need to do so arose by night or by day. But if anyone turns the soldiers' minds from merely brooding on what they are going to suffer, and instead gets them to concentrate on what they are going to do, they will be much more stout-hearted. You know, of course, that it is neither numbers nor brute force that brings victories in war. Instead, whichever army, backed by the gods, advances against the enemy in the more vigorous spirit finds that their opponents do not generally wait to receive their charge. I myself, men, have taken to heart that in war those who cast about by every means they can to remain alive are precisely those who generally meet a bad and shameful end. By contrast, I see that those who have learned that death is common to all and unavoidable for human beings, and who compete for the prize of an honorable death, are the ones who somehow or other reach old age and enjoy a happier existence as long as they live. Having now learned these lessons, and since we are at such a critical juncture, we too must both be good men ourselves and also summon the others to join us." End quote. The officers elected 5 more generals to replace the ones that were lost. Timazion of Dardanos replaced Clearchus. Xanthocles of Achaia replaced Socrates, not the philosopher, this is a different Socrates. Cleonor of Arcadia replaced Augeas. Philesius of Achaia replaced Menon. And Xenophon of Athens replaced his friend Proxenos. Now, the last step to putting a plan into action was, like Xenophon said at the end there, to get the rank-and-file soldiers on board. Which is no small task, by the way. This was a pan-Hellenic army of mercenaries who may or may not follow orders now that their former commanders were gone, and even if they did follow orders, they might not do so enthusiastically unless they were first made to believe in the mission. And since the survival of everyone now depended on success, and success depended on cohesion, it was absolutely critical for everybody to be on board. That was the reason for kicking out Apollonides, so he couldn't potentially spread dissension through the ranks. The newly elected generals assembled the men, still in the middle of the night, and spoke to them. First, an officer named Chrysophos spoke to them. Now, this Chrysophos was not one of the 5 elected generals, but he was a Spartan, a countryman of Clearchus, and will become an important figure in his own right through the rest of this story. He spoke first and laid out the basic situation to the men. Then Cleonor spoke up, criticizing the Persians for having betrayed their oaths before the gods. Then Xenophon spoke in more detail, both motivating the men and proposing plans for what they should actually do. This is the longest speech in the book so far for him, but I'm going to read it in full because it's really good. He said, quote, "Cleonor speaks of the perjury and faithlessness of the barbarians, and these are well known to you too, I think. If, then, we want to revert to being on friendly terms with them, we shall necessarily be in great despondency, since we see what has happened to the generals who, out of trust, put themselves into their hands. But if we concentrate on using our weapons to exact justice from them for what they did, and on carrying on total war against them thereafter, with the aid of the gods, we have many excellent grounds to hope for a safe return." Then narrator Xenophon breaks in. As he was saying this, someone sneezed, and when the soldiers heard it, with a single impulse they all knelt and worshipped the god. Xenophon then went on. Continuing speech, Xenophon. "It seems to me, men, that since an omen from Zeus the Savior manifested itself while we were speaking about our safe return, we should vow to this god to perform a sacrifice for our safe delivery whenever we first arrive in friendly territory. And we should make a further vow to perform sacrifices to the other gods as well, to the best of our ability. Whoever thinks this is a good idea, raise your hand." Narrator Xenophon again. Every one of them raised their hands. As a result, they made the vows and sang a war hymn. When they had properly attended to the business of the gods, Xenophon began to speak again as follows. Continuing the speech. "What I was saying was that we had many excellent grounds to hope for a safe return. First, we are upholding our oaths to the gods, while the enemy have perjured themselves and broken the truce contrary to their oaths. In this situation, it is likely that the gods are opponents of the enemy and allies of ours, and they have the ability quickly to make the strong weak and to save the weak even in terrible circumstances, whenever they want and without any effort. Next, I shall remind you of the dangers our ancestors faced, so that you may know that it is appropriate for you to act as good men do, and also that, with the aid of the gods, the good are saved even from very terrible troubles. For when the Persians and their followers came in overwhelming force on their expedition to annihilate Athens, the Athenians dared to withstand them and were victorious over them. They had made a vow to Artemis that however many of the enemy they slaughtered, they would sacrifice as many goats to the goddess. Since they were unable to find sufficient goats, they decided to perform the sacrifice with 500 goats each year, and they still carry out this sacrifice even now. Next, when Xerxes subsequently gathered together that innumerable army and attacked Greece, our ancestors were victorious over the ancestors of these people, both on land and at sea. Seeing the trophies they put up provides evidence of this, but the greatest proof is the freedom of the cities in which you were born and brought up, for you kneel and worship to no human being as master, but to the gods alone. Such are your ancestors. I do not say this in the least to imply that you are disgracing those ancestors. On the contrary, not many days since, you were arrayed in ranks against these people here, the descendants of those Persians of old, and with the aid of the gods you were victorious over them, though they were many times your number. On that occasion, when the issue was the kingship of Cyrus, you acted as good men do, and now, when the contest is about your own preservation, it is surely appropriate for you to be both better still and more eager. And furthermore, you should now also be more confident in relation to the enemy. For then, with no prior experience of them and despite seeing their uncountable numbers, you still dared to advance on them with the high spirit of your fathers. So now, when you have already made trial of them and found that they are unwilling to stand firm against you, although they are many times your number, why should you be afraid of them any longer? Nor indeed should you imagine that you are in a worse position because the Persians who were previously drawn up alongside us have now deserted. They are still worse than those who were overcome by you. At any rate, when they abandoned us, the troops they were avoiding were the troops we overcame. Where people are willing to take the lead in flight, it is far better to see them drawn up alongside the enemy than in our own ranks. And if any of you are dispirited because we have no cavalry, and among the enemy there are many, take this to heart. 10,000 cavalry are just the same thing as 10,000 human beings, as nobody ever dies in battle from being bitten or kicked by a horse. It is men who do whatever is done in battles. Well then, certainly compared to horsemen, we are on a much safer platform, for they are perched up on the horses, afraid not only of us but also of falling off, whereas we, firmly placed on the ground, will strike much more powerfully if anyone comes against us, and will be much more likely to land our blow on target. In one point alone cavalry have the advantage. To flee is safer for them than for us. But despite being in good heart as regards the fighting, you may be weighed down by the thought that Tissaphernes will no longer be acting as your guide, and the king will not be providing us with a market. If you are, and I say if, consider whether it is such a good thing to have Tissaphernes as a guide, someone who is clearly plotting against us. Isn't it better to use men we have captured, who guide us under our orders and who will know that if they make some mistake in what concerns us, they will find that to be a mistake for their own lives and limbs? Consider further whether it is such a good thing to buy food supplies from the market, where these people give us small measures of food for large amounts of money, which we no longer have. Isn't it better for us just to take our food supplies if we gain the upper hand, using however large a measure each one of us wants? And if you understand that you are better off in these respects, but you think that the rivers are an insuperable obstacle, and strongly suppose that you were deceived when you crossed over, consider whether in reality this is not the stupidest thing the barbarians have done. On the one hand, even if rivers may be impossible to cross far from their sources, when one approaches closer to the sources, they all become fordable without even getting one's knees wet. Then, on the other hand, even if the rivers bar our way through and no guide appears to help us, there is still no need for us to lose heart. For we know that the Mysians, who we would not say are better than we are, inhabit many great and prosperous cities in the land of the king against the king's will. We know the same of the Pisidians, and we ourselves have seen how the Lycaonians have taken over the strong points in the plains and harvest the king's land. And speaking for myself, I would say that we should not make it clear that we have set out for home, but instead should make preparations as if we were going to live somewhere around here. For I am sure that the king would provide the Mysians with many guides and many pledges of a genuine safe conduct abroad, and would go so far as to make a road for them if they wanted to depart riding in 4-horse chariots. And I am sure he would be 3 times as glad to do this for us if he saw that we were planning to stay. But my real fear is that once we learn to live in idleness and spend our time in the midst of abundance, consorting with the big and beautiful Median and Persian women and girls, then, like the lotus eaters, we shall forget the homeward road. So it seems to me fair and reasonable to try first to reach Greece and our people at home and show the Greeks that it is by their own choice that they are poor. For they could see citizens now living in hardship in Greece instead become rich once they have brought themselves here. But however that may be, what's clear, men, is that all these things belong to those who are the stronger. And now it's necessary to say how we might make our way on from here most securely, and how we might fight most effectively, if we have to fight. In the first place, then, I think that we should burn the wagons we have so that it is not the draft animals that determine our strategy, but instead we can make our way by whatever route best suits the army. Then I think we should burn the tents at the same time, for again with them comes the bother of carrying them, and they contribute nothing either to the fighting or to obtaining food supplies. Going still further, let's also leave behind the superfluous equipment and the rest of the baggage, excluding what we have for warfare or for food or drink, in order that as many as possible of us may be under arms, and as few as possible baggage carriers. For as you know, when people are conquered, everything they had becomes the property of others. But if we gain the upper hand, we should think of the enemy as having acted as our baggage carriers. It remains for me to make what I think is actually the most important point of all. You are aware that our enemies did not dare to start making war on us until they had seized hold of the generals, thinking that while we had officers and were obedient to them, we were sufficiently strong to prevail in the war, but that when they had captured our officers, we should perish in anarchy and indiscipline. It is therefore necessary for the officers now to become much more careful than their predecessors, and for the rank and file now to be much more orderly and obedient to their officers than they were before. But in case someone is disobedient in future, you must vote here and now that whoever among you happens to be there at the time is to join the officer in punishing him. Thus the enemy will find themselves very much mistaken. For then they will this very day see the one Clearchus replaced by 10,000 who will not put up with any misbehavior. But it is now time to bring my speech to a close and put it into practice, for perhaps the enemy will be near us very soon. So whoever thinks that my proposals are right should ratify them as soon as possible in order for them to be carried into effect. And if there is something better than this, even the rank-and-file soldier should not be afraid to teach us what it is, since we all want the whole army's safety." End quote. So, if I can sum that up, Xenophon tells the men, the Persians are a bunch of damn lying oath-breakers, we're better than them and they know it, the gods favor us because we keep our oaths, and we're going to kill them and take their stuff until they beg us to leave. Quite the motivational speech to these men who had now been placed in this impossible situation that they'd never asked for. Enemies on every side, 1,000 miles from friendly territory with all their regular leadership dead and green officers in their place. Xenophon's motivational speech notwithstanding, this situation in reality was about as dire gets. But on the other hand, from another perspective, one might see this situation as a gift from the gods, an opportunity for these men to show their grit and resilience, to win undying glory for themselves by showing that they were no lesser men than their ancestors who defeated Darius at Marathon, died holding the pass at Thermopylae, and turned the Persians away for good at Salamis and Plataea. Not for gold, not for power, not even for their own homeland, but for glory, for survival, and for the men standing next to them. After doing a little bit of campaign planning, Xenophon made one last appeal to the men before they embarked on this mission of survival. He said, quote, "So now then, we have to go and do what has been agreed. Whoever among you wants to see his folks at home, remember to be a good man, for in no other way is it possible to achieve this. Whoever wants to stay alive, let him strive to be victorious. For slaying others is the lot of the victors, and being killed is the lot of the defeated. And if anyone wants riches, let him strive to prevail, for it belongs to the victors both to preserve their own possessions and to obtain those of the defeated." End quote. The Greeks were about to declare open war on Artaxerxes. No more of this begging for approval from Tissaphernes or any other of the king's underlings. The feat they were about to attempt, marching alone and unsupported through 1,000 miles of hostile territory back to their homes, was, as far as I know, unprecedented in the history of ancient warfare up to this point. There's nothing else quite like it that you'll ever read in any of these ancient sources, that's for sure. If they failed, they would simply die and be lost to history, just another group of Greek mercenaries, albeit a large one, that marched off into Persia never to be heard from again. But if they succeeded, although none of them might have realized this at the time, they would forge a legend worthy to stand right alongside Achilles, Leonidas, Themistocles, and Pericles. And the fact that we can still read this story in Xenophon's book should give you a hint of how it would turn out. The choices were clear: become legendary or die in the attempt. Well, welcome back to the Unsung Podcast. I hope you enjoyed this one. Like I said in the intro, this series is going to be smaller and less research intensive than the first one, so it shouldn't take me quite so long to get the next one out. I am still working on the Mormon series. I haven't forgotten about it, but also, like I said, that one's going to take me quite a lot longer to research, so I hope this works well for something in between. In the meantime, you can check me out at the Unsung Substack. Link to that is in the show notes. If you appreciate this show and you want to help me make more of it, please consider subscribing there for $5 a month or $50 a year. I greatly appreciate everybody who has done so already. If you'd rather make a one-time donation, you can do that through PayPal or Venmo. Those links are also in the show notes. Any questions or comments, feel free to DM me over at Substack or send me an email at unsung.substack@gmail.com. I'm pretty responsive to both of those. Also, check out my audiobook that's out right now on Audible. It's a pulp western adventure novel called Medicine Woman, authored by my friend Frank Kidd and narrated by me. The link to that is in the show notes. I've recently completed work on another audiobook authored by another friend of mine, and I don't think that one will be released yet by the time this episode goes out, but I will put out an announcement when it is, so you won't miss it. I'm excited about this one too, and I have several more audiobooks in the pipeline right now, so stay tuned. So with all of that said, thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join me again for The Warriors Part 2, that the deeds of men shall not go unsung.